Hey there, welcome to Broderos. Tonight, we've got hours of chilling horror stories combined with soothing rain sounds to help you relax and sleep. Before you drift off, leave a comment below and let us know where you're listening from and what time it is. And don't forget to hit that like button and subscribe right away. If you end up not enjoying it, you can always take it back later. Get cozy and let the fear take over. Have you ever wondered what it would be like if the silence was broken by something other than your own thoughts? I don't know what I was expecting when I found the first drawing. It was just lying there on the ground, as if someone had dropped it carelessly, but I knew it wasn't mine. At first glance, it seemed like a child's simple drawing, a sun in the corner, stick figure people standing in front of a house. The colors were faded, as if they had been left out in the rain for too long, and yet the paper felt oddly warm in my hands, as though it had been touched recently. But what caught my attention were the figures in the background. They were just shadows, dark, indistinct shapes that shouldn't have been there. They were too tall, too thin, and they stood motionless, as if waiting for something. Or someone. I didn't think much of it at first. After all, children draw strange things all the time. But when I looked around, I realized I was alone. The park was empty, save for me and the rustling of the wind through the trees. I hadn't even noticed that the sound of children playing had disappeared. I bent down to pick up the paper, my fingers brushing against the edges, and something in the air changed. It wasn't a sound, not exactly. More like a pressure, a heavy weight pressing in on my chest. That's when I heard it, faint, almost like a whisper. A voice, but not a voice. It was the kind of sound that you feel more than you hear, the kind that gets into your skin and crawls under it. The trees around me seemed to sway unnaturally, their branches twisting like they were reaching for something. I shoved the drawing into my jacket pocket, telling myself I was imagining things. But I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. That something was waiting for me. The next day, I found another drawing. This time, it was on the doorsteps of my apartment building. Same faded colors, same strange figures in the background. The sun was gone now, replaced by a pale moon that hung too low in the sky. The stick figures were the same, but now they were no longer standing. They were lying on the ground, as though something had knocked them down. And behind them, those shapes, those tall, dark, moving figures. I stood frozen, staring at the drawing, my breath catching in my throat. I had seen these figures before. The same tall, thin shapes. They were in my dreams. It was as if the drawings had crossed over from some nightmare, becoming real. I thought of the children who had disappeared over the past few weeks. They weren't just disappearing, they were leaving something behind. Drawings. Always drawings. I'd heard the whispers in the news reports. Children gone missing without a trace, their parents frantic, searching for answers that never came. The police had no leads. No explanation. But I knew something. I knew that these drawings were connected to the disappearances. That somehow they were a sign. But what kind of sign? I couldn't stop thinking about it. And I couldn't stop seeing them, those figures, lurking in the corners of my vision, just out of reach. Every time I turned a corner, I felt something watching me, following me. The next night, as I lay in bed, I heard the scratching again. It was faint, almost imperceptible, but it was there. A quiet, persistent sound coming from the hallway outside my apartment. I froze, my heart hammering in my chest. It sounded like someone dragging their fingers along the wall. At first, I told myself it was just the building settling. But then the scratching grew louder, closer, as if whatever it was moving toward me. I couldn't move. My limbs felt numb, my breath shallow. Every instinct screamed at me to get up, to run, but I couldn't. The scratching stopped just outside my door. Then there was silence. A long, suffocating silence. And then something different. A soft thud. The sound of something heavy hitting the floor. It was the sound of a body. A body that had fallen. I didn't dare open the door. I couldn't. Instead, I reached for my phone, my fingers trembling as I dialed the number for the police. But before I could press call, the phone slipped from my hand and crashed to the floor, its screen shattering into 1,000 tiny pieces. The silence returned. But now, it wasn't just silence. It was thick, suffocating, as if the very air was pressing down on me. I could hear my own heartbeat in my ears, the blood rushing in my veins. And then I saw it. A shadow in the hallway. A figure, tall and thin, standing just outside the crack in the door. It wasn't moving. It was watching me. I didn't know what to do. I didn't know if I was dreaming, if this was some twisted nightmare I couldn't wake up from. And then I remembered the drawing. The one I had found the day before. The one with the shadow figures. It was them. They were real. I don't know how much time passed before I finally gathered the courage to open the door. When I did, I found nothing. The hallway was empty. The scratching had stopped. But as I stepped outside, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was still there, watching me from the corners of my eyes. I walked slowly down the hallway, my breath catching in my throat with each step, my eyes darting around, searching for any sign of movement. And that's when I saw it. A drawing. This time, it wasn't on paper. It was on the wall, drawn in what looked like charcoal, smeared into the cracks in the plaster. It was a drawing of me. A stick figure with dark, hollow eyes, lying in front of a door. And behind it, standing tall and still in the darkness, the same figures. Watching. I wasn't sure what had just happened, but I knew one thing for certain: I was next. The feeling of being watched didn't go away. It stayed with me, like a shadow clinging to my every movement, growing ever closer. Something had changed. Something was happening. And I wasn't sure I was ready to face it. I couldn't sleep. Not after seeing that drawing. Not after realizing that the figures in the hallway weren't just a hallucination or a nightmare. They were real. They were connected to the disappearances. And now they were after me. I sat in the dark of my apartment, eyes wide open, staring at the door, listening to every creak and groan of the building. The silence was oppressive, thick, like it was waiting for something. Waiting for me to make the wrong move. I tried to tell myself that I was just imagining things. That the drawing had been a fluke, that it was just a coincidence. But deep down, I knew better. The feeling of being watched had grown stronger. Every corner of the room felt like it was closing in on me. Every shadow felt like it was reaching out, trying to grab hold. I forced myself to leave the apartment the next morning. The city was quieter than usual, like everyone was holding their breath. There was a palpable tension in the air, a sense that something was wrong, though no one could quite put their finger on it. I went to the local newsstand, hoping for some distraction, but the headlines were all the same: missing children, and more of them every day. I'd seen these reports before, but today they felt different. They felt closer. As if the disappearance of every child was a countdown, and I was next. But it wasn't just the news that unnerved me. Everywhere I went, I saw drawings. On lamp posts, on walls, even on the pavement, children's drawings. The same stick figures. The same tall, thin shapes lurking in the background. Everywhere I looked, they were there, staring back at me. The air seemed to thicken as I walked, the light dimming just a little bit more with every step. I couldn't escape them. I tried to distract myself by going to a cafe, ordering a coffee and sitting by the window, hoping that something, anything, would make me feel normal again. But as I sat there, staring at the empty street, I noticed something in the reflection of the glass. A figure. Tall. Thin. It stood motionless across the street, its face obscured by shadows. But I could feel its eyes on me, watching. My heart raced, and I looked away quickly, trying to convince myself it was just my mind playing tricks on me. But when I glanced back, it was gone. A shiver ran down my spine. I tried to shake it off, but the feeling of being followed didn't subside. It only grew stronger. The days passed in a blur. I couldn't focus on anything. I couldn't shake the feeling that something terrible was about to happen. That whatever was happening with the children, whatever was behind the drawings, had its sights set on me. I found myself walking the streets at night, unable to sleep. It was quieter than usual, the kind of silence that feels unnatural, like the world is holding its breath. I heard the faint sound of footsteps behind me. I turned around, but no one was there. It happened again and again. The footsteps, the feeling of something lurking just out of sight. But every time I turned, I saw nothing. Until that night. I had been walking for hours, my feet taking me down familiar streets that felt strangely unfamiliar. The air was damp, and the streetlights flickered overhead. The silence was deafening, and my mind raced with the possibility that I was being hunted. I stopped in front of a playground, the swing set swaying gently in the wind, though there was no breeze. There, on the ground by the swings, was a drawing. I bent down to pick it up, and my blood ran cold. It was a picture of the playground, of the swing set, of the same shadowy figures standing behind it, their faces twisted, their features distorted. But this time, there was something else. A figure, smaller than the rest. A stick figure that looked almost like a child. But it wasn't me. It was someone else. Before I could fully comprehend what I was seeing, I heard the sound of footsteps behind me. And then, something worse. A voice. A whisper, soft but insistent, like it was calling my name. I turned around quickly, but once again, there was no one there. But the whisper didn't stop. It came again, louder this time. Come closer. It wasn't a plea. It wasn't a demand. It was a command. I stumbled backward, my heart racing, but I couldn't move fast enough. The shadows around me shifted, and I could feel the figures closing in, surrounding me. Come closer. The voice was all around me now. It echoed in my mind, reverberating through my bones. I could feel them watching me, waiting for me to make a move. I wanted to scream, to run, to get away, but my body wouldn't respond. I was frozen, trapped in the grip of something I couldn't see, couldn't understand. And then I saw it. One of the tall, thin figures stepped forward from the darkness, its face still obscured by shadows. Its movements were jerky, unnatural, like it wasn't quite real. Like it was slipping in and out of existence. It pointed at me. And then, I saw it in the reflection of the swing set. Another drawing. A drawing of me, lying motionless with no way to escape. I don't know how I managed to escape that night. Maybe I didn't. Maybe I'm still running, trapped in some nightmare where the figures are always one step behind. But I can't stop thinking about the drawings, about the children, about the whispers. I don't know who they are. I don't know why they're doing this. But I know one thing for sure. I can't outrun them. The drawing that had haunted me was still in my pocket, crumpled and worn. I hadn't let go of it. And I knew I couldn't, because the moment I did, the darkness would consume me completely. And yet, the drawings kept coming. And now, they were all coming for me. The next few days blurred into a haze of fear. I couldn't focus on anything, couldn't escape the feeling that something was always just behind me, watching. The whispers were constant, following me wherever I went. They echoed in the corners of my mind, their words like nails on a chalkboard, never stopping, always pulling me deeper into the abyss. I stayed inside for most of the time, locking the windows, drawing the curtains. The city outside felt like it belonged to someone else, like I had been cut off from reality. But even inside, I could feel it, the presence. The figures. They were there, always. That night, the whispers grew louder. I woke suddenly, drenched in sweat, heart pounding. The room was suffocatingly silent, but I could feel them. The figures. They were in the room with me. I dared not move, afraid that if I did, they would see me. The shadows in the corners of my room seemed to stretch and shift, growing longer, twisting into shapes that didn't make sense. And then, there it was. A soft knock at the door. I froze, the blood draining from my face. No one ever knocked at my door at this hour. I crept out of bed slowly, my feet barely making a sound on the cold floor. I felt every inch of the room closing in on me as I approached the door. Another knock, louder this time. The voice whispered again, right outside the door. "Open it." I shook my head, trying to block out the sound, trying to force myself to breathe. But my hand was already on the door handle. It moved on its own, against my will. Slowly, the door creaked open. No one was there. But there, just on the floor, was another drawing. This one was different. It was a picture of my apartment, of the room I was standing in. And there, in the corner of the drawing, was a figure. A child, with hollow eyes, standing just behind me. I spun around, but the room was empty. Empty except for the shadows, which seemed darker now. I could hear the faint sound of breathing, a low, uneven rhythm coming from somewhere in the darkness. I wasn't alone. I bolted out of the room, racing through the apartment. I slammed the door shut behind me, leaning against it as if somehow it would protect me from whatever was coming. But I knew better. I could feel them. They were already inside. The whispers grew louder, clearer, as if the figures were right there beside me. I stumbled down the hallway, searching for an escape. The apartment building, once so familiar, now felt like a maze, twisting and turning in on itself. The walls seemed to close in, the air thick with an oppressive weight. Every room I passed, I checked. Every corner I turned, I half expected to see them standing there, waiting. The shadows twisted, their forms shifting, flickering in and out of reality. I thought I saw them in the mirror, their long, thin arms reaching out from behind me, their eyes empty and hollow. I reached the stairwell, but the door was locked. A distant sound broke through the madness, a faint, rhythmic tapping. A knock. I turned around, terrified. There was no one there. But the sound continued. Closer now. The steps, light but deliberate, echoed through the empty hallway. I looked down at the drawing in my hand. The child's eyes were no longer hollow. They were wide open, and I could see something behind them. A reflection of me. Of my fear. Another knock. I ran. I don't know where I went after that. It all became a blur. The alleyways, the empty streets, the endless night. But I couldn't shake the feeling that they were behind me. That they were in every shadow, in every corner, waiting for me to slip up. And then I saw it. A figure in the distance. It was small, but unmistakable. A child, standing in the middle of the road, facing away from me. The streetlights flickered, casting long, twisted shadows around the figure. I couldn't move. My feet felt rooted to the ground. I wanted to scream, but no sound came out. And then, the figure turned. Its face was distorted, a mask of emptiness, like the eyes had been scraped clean, leaving nothing but hollow sockets. Its mouth stretched wide, impossibly so, as if it were ready to swallow the whole world. The whispers were deafening now, all around me, in my ears, in my head. I couldn't escape them. The child began to walk toward me, its movements jerky, unnatural. Each step was deliberate, as though it knew exactly what it was doing. I ran. I didn't know where to go, but I ran anyway. My heart pounded in my chest as I sprinted down the street, the sound of the footsteps behind me growing louder, closer. The shadows seemed to reach out, trying to grab me, but I couldn't stop. I had to keep moving. But the street stretched on endlessly. The lights flickered and dimmed, and I could feel the world collapsing around me. I wasn't sure how long I ran for. It felt like hours, days, maybe even longer. But when I finally stopped, out of breath, I realized I wasn't alone. The child was there, standing in front of me, its hollow eyes locked on mine. The whispers stopped. Everything stopped. And then it spoke. "You're next." I woke up in my apartment. The room was dark, silent, except for the sound of my own breathing. I could still feel the child's eyes on me, the weight of its gaze pressing down on me. I didn't know if it was a dream or if it was real. But I knew one thing for sure. They were getting closer. I woke up in my bed, drenched in sweat, my heart racing as though it had never stopped. The remnants of the dream lingered, like a heavy fog in my mind. But it wasn't just the dream that had me terrified, it was the feeling that something had followed me back. That somehow, they were still there, lurking in the shadows of my mind and the corners of my room. I sat up, my hands shaking. The silence was deafening, almost suffocating. It had been so still when I woke, too still, and I couldn't shake the thought that I was being watched. I rubbed my eyes, trying to clear the haze of sleep and dread. The clock on the wall ticked away, its rhythmic sound almost too loud in the silence. But that wasn't what caught my attention. It was the drawing. The same one. The one that had haunted me ever since I found it. The one of the child with the hollow eyes. It was sitting on the floor at the foot of my bed, as if it had been placed there deliberately. And it was different. There, beneath the child's feet, was something new. A symbol. It looked like an intricate web, drawn with thin black ink, stretching out from the child's feet, creeping up the edges of the paper. My fingers hovered over the drawing, and as I touched the edges of the web, I felt a chill run through me, sharp and sudden. The room felt colder. I quickly grabbed the drawing, crumpling it in my hand and throwing it into the trash bin. But the sense of unease didn't fade. It grew. I stood up, trying to shake off the sense of wrongness, but every movement felt sluggish, like I was walking through thick mud. The silence of the apartment was now oppressive, suffocating. I couldn't hear anything, no sounds from the streets, no hum of the refrigerator, no air moving in the vents. Just the heavy stillness that seemed to press against me from all sides. As I walked through the apartment, checking each room, it became clear. The silence was not just in my head, it was everywhere. The air was thick, stifling. I reached the kitchen, but when I turned the light on, I froze. There was something on the counter. Another drawing. I hadn't heard the sound of the paper moving, hadn't felt the shift in the atmosphere, but there it was, sitting on the counter like it had always been there, waiting for me. I didn't even need to get close to see it. The child was there again, the same hollow eyes, but this time the drawing was different. The child was standing in front of a door, my door, the one to the apartment, the one I had locked just hours before. The door was slightly ajar in the drawing. And there, behind the door, was the same symbol from before, the one I had seen beneath the child's feet. I stepped back, my heart pounding in my chest. This couldn't be happening. This couldn't be real. But the terror that gripped me was undeniable. The symbol was everywhere. It was in the drawing, in the corners of the room, in my mind. I glanced at the clock again. The hands had stopped moving. Time had frozen. Everything was still. The world outside, the one I had once felt so safe in, had become alien to me. The silence felt like it was swallowing me whole. I needed to leave. I needed to escape before whatever was coming reached me. But the door, I couldn't bring myself to open it. I grabbed my coat, my hand shaking as I pulled it on, my breath shallow and quick. I reached for the door handle, but the moment my fingers brushed it, the whispers started. Low at first, a barely audible murmur in the back of my mind, but they quickly grew louder, more insistent. Open the door. The voice was soft, almost childlike, but there was something in it, a hunger, a desperation, that sent a chill through my bones. I jerked my hand away from the handle, my pulse racing. The whispers became louder, filling the apartment with a maddening cacophony. I couldn't hear anything else. I couldn't think. I turned around, looking for a way out, but the room felt smaller now. The walls were closing in. The shadows in the corners of the room had thickened, stretching toward me, reaching for me with unseen hands. There was no escape. And then, just as I was about to lose control, I heard it. A knock. Soft, but deliberate. Coming from the other side of the door. I froze. The knock came again, louder this time, followed by a scraping sound, like nails on wood. I wasn't sure how long I stood there, paralyzed with fear, but when I finally found the strength to move, I bolted toward the door. My hands fumbled at the lock, my breath coming in short, panicked gasps. But before I could open it, I felt something, a pressure, on the other side. Something was pushing against the door. I took a step back, heart pounding in my chest, the room spinning around me. The whispers were so loud now, I couldn't tell if they were real or just inside my head. And then, in the midst of the chaos, I saw it. A small hand, pale and trembling, reaching through the crack in the door. The fingers were thin, almost skeletal, but there was no mistaking it. A child's hand. Before I could react, the door slammed open with a deafening crash. The air grew cold, freezing the breath in my lungs. And standing there, in the doorway, was the figure I had seen in my dreams. The child with the hollow eyes. But now, it was real. The mask of emptiness, the distorted face, it was standing right in front of me, its eyes locked onto mine. And in that moment, I knew. I was no longer alone. I could barely breathe. The air had turned to ice, and every inch of my body screamed at me to run, to flee from the thing standing in the doorway. But my legs refused to move. I was frozen, paralyzed, staring at the hollow-eyed child. Its eyes, those empty, black voids, locked with mine. There was no expression, no emotion, nothing but the absence of something that should have been there. It was like looking into an endless abyss, where all light and warmth had been swallowed whole. The whispers returned, this time more distinct, more insistent, filling my mind with cold urgency. Run, escape, you cannot stay here. But I couldn't tear my eyes away. The child stood there, its small, frail hands still reaching out, fingers twitching with a strange, jerky motion as though it were trying to pull something from me. I could feel the weight of its gaze, a pressure that bore down on my chest, making it hard to breathe. The child's lips parted, but no sound came. The air seemed to warp around it, twisting the very space between us, stretching the seconds into an eternity. And then, from the depths of that silence, it spoke. "Come with me." The voice was soft, childlike, but there was an unmistakable edge to it, a quiet command that filled me with dread. It wasn't a question. It was an order. I couldn't tear my gaze from the creature. It was as though something invisible had a grip on me, a pull that I couldn't resist, no matter how desperately I wanted to run. My heart pounded in my ears, drying out everything but the sound of my own breath and the relentless whispering. "Come with me, come." The words repeated, like a chant, growing louder and louder until they drowned everything out, until the world outside the apartment disappeared, until the silence swallowed me whole. I didn't know how long I stood there, rooted to the spot, my body trembling from head to toe. But eventually, the child stepped forward, its movements jerky and unnatural, like a marionette being pulled by invisible strings. Its foot crossed the threshold of the door, and as it did, the temperature dropped even further. I could see my breath, puffing out in small clouds, the chill seeping into my bones. My hand instinctively reached for the door handle, and with a violent wrench, I slammed it shut. But I heard the soft, slow scrape of fingers against the wood, like claws dragging across the surface. A scratching sound, rhythmic and deliberate. I backed away from the door, my heart racing, the whispers filling my mind again. I turned toward the window, hoping, praying that I could escape through it. But it was just as I feared. The room was no longer my own. The walls had closed in, the edges of the room shifting, stretching in unnatural angles. The windows, once clear and open to the outside world, were now hazy, clouded over with an impenetrable fog. I felt trapped. And then the knocking started again. This time, it was louder, faster, more frantic. The same nails-on wood sound, each knock vibrating through my chest like the beat of a drum. The pressure behind the door was increasing, the knocking turning into a full-on pounding, as though something on the other side was desperate to break through. I grabbed a chair, pushing it against the door in a futile attempt to hold it shut. But the pounding only intensified, shaking the walls around me, vibrating the very floor beneath my feet. The floorboards creaked and groaned as if they, too, were alive, as though the house itself were breathing with the same terrible anticipation. The whispers turned into cries, the child's voice twisting into something dark and guttural, a low, rasping sound that sent a jolt of fear through my spine. Come with me now." The words had become distorted, as though something was trying to crawl out of them, something ancient and wrong. I turned away from the door, desperate for an escape. My eyes darted around the room, looking for any way out. But nothing. Everything was closing in, the walls pressing tighter, the shadows darkening. And then I saw it. In the far corner of the room, where the darkness seemed to grow thicker, I noticed something that hadn't been there before. A doorway, small, almost imperceptible, as if it had appeared from nowhere. It was a narrow arch, barely wide enough to fit through, but it beckoned to me like a lifeline. There was no choice left. I had to move. Without thinking, I rushed toward the door, my hands fumbling against the wall as I tried to find the handle. The whispers were louder now, the voices swirling in my mind like a whirlpool. But I didn't stop. I couldn't. I reached the door, my fingers brushing against the cold metal of the handle. Just as I was about to turn it, a voice came from behind me, sharp and piercing. "You cannot leave." I spun around, heart in my throat, only to see the child standing at the door once more, its hollow eyes boring into me. The air grew thick with tension, the pressure around me unbearable. For a moment, I thought I might lose my mind. The room had become a prison, the whispers growing louder, the shadows darker. The child was closing in on me, its movements slow but deliberate, its fingers outstretched, reaching for me. My breath quickened, my pulse racing. But before it could reach me, the door behind me opened. I didn't think. I ran. The room behind me seemed to stretch on forever, the dark hallways swallowing me whole. I didn't look back. I didn't dare. The child's voice echoed in my mind, but I forced it out, focusing only on the narrow hallway ahead. I ran, and I didn't stop. But I could still hear it. The whispers. The footsteps behind me. It wasn't over. Not yet. Have you ever noticed something in the corner of your eye, just out of reach of your understanding, that gnaws at your mind long after you've turned away? It's that kind of unsettling feeling I had every night. At first, it was small, an odd flicker beneath the door to the room next to mine. I would catch it while brushing my teeth, or when my mind was half drifting into sleep. It was subtle, like the glow of a streetlight filtering through blinds, but it was never there for long. A flash, then gone. Every time, just before I could fully process it, the light vanished. I tried to convince myself that it was nothing. Maybe the old lamp in the hallway flickered on and off, or it was a trick of the light. But the light, that light, felt wrong. It wasn't ordinary. It was strange, almost unnatural. I began to notice it more often, each time catching a glimpse as I passed by the door. At first, I dismissed it. Just the old wiring, I told myself. The building's getting older, things flicker, it happens. But one evening, it was different. The light stayed, seeping out from under the door like a thin, golden thread of warmth, pushing against the dark shadows of the hallway. I couldn't ignore it any longer. I had to see where it came from. I took a deep breath and walked to the door. It was late, long after midnight. The apartment was quiet, almost too quiet. The hum of the refrigerator, the soft creak of the old wood beneath my feet, these sounds had become my companions in the stillness of the night. I reached the door and stood there, my hand hovering over the handle. My heart pounded, thudding in my chest louder than it should have. It's just light, I reminded myself. Just a lamp. Nothing to worry about. But something inside me hesitated. I don't know if it was fear or curiosity, but I couldn't make myself turn the handle. Not yet. I backed away, feeling a knot form in my stomach. The light still seeped from beneath the door, pulsing faintly, as if alive. There was something wrong with it. I was sure of it. Yet, I couldn't explain why. The first few days, I thought I could ignore it. But every time I tried to go to bed, it would be there, waiting, just a small flicker at first, but then it would grow, stretching out from the crack of the door like a thin veil of fog. Each night, the light grew a little brighter, a little stronger. I couldn't tell where it was coming from. The room on the other side was dark when I opened the door, but the light, it was there. It never reached far enough for me to touch it, but it hung in the air, filling the narrow gap beneath the door, shimmering just enough to make the shadows dance on the walls. Eventually, the desire to understand what was happening became too much to ignore. I stood before the door one evening, after hearing the same familiar hum of silence around me, and decided I would open it. I would prove to myself that it was nothing more than a trick of the mind, a wayward reflection, or the weird angle of light from the street outside. With a deep breath, I grabbed the handle and turned it. The moment I opened the door, the light disappeared. The room inside was exactly as I had left it, dark, empty, and still. There was no lamp, no flickering light, nothing. It was the same as always. I stepped inside, my breath shaky. I looked around, scanning every corner, every surface. Nothing was out of place. The walls were bare, the air was cold, and the silence pressed in on me like a thick fog. I don't know how long I stood there, staring into the empty room. But then, just as I turned to leave, I heard it. A low hum, almost imperceptible, but unmistakable. The sound was coming from the walls, from the floor itself, vibrating against my skin. I froze. That sound. It was the same as before, the hum I had heard every night. But now, it felt different. It felt like it was coming from inside the very building, like the house itself was alive. I stepped backward, my heart racing in my chest. The light had returned. Not from the door, but from the walls. It shimmered through the cracks, casting strange patterns on the floor. For a moment, I thought I saw figures moving within the shadows, but when I blinked, they were gone. I slammed the door shut behind me and leaned against it, breathing heavily. The hum didn't stop, but it was muffled now, as if I had shut it out. But I couldn't shake the feeling that someone, was still there, watching me. The light under the door was gone, but the house had never felt colder. The next night, I tried to convince myself it was just my imagination. Perhaps I had overreacted. The hum was probably just the old pipes, or the wind, or something else that was normal, but I couldn't shake the unease that crawled under my skin. The coldness that had crept into the apartment lingered, like a shadow that refused to leave. I told myself I was just being paranoid. It had to be. I had seen the room, I had heard the hum, and nothing had changed. But as the evening wore on, I found myself drawn back to that door, the one that led to the empty, silent room. Every part of me wanted to ignore it, to stay away and put it out of my mind, but I couldn't. That same light, it was back. It wasn't as bright as before, but it was unmistakable. A soft, golden glow pushing against the edges of the door, spilling into the hallway like liquid light. For a moment, I stood there, frozen, watching it, wondering if my mind was playing tricks on me. The light didn't fade away this time. It stayed, pulsing slowly, almost as if it were breathing. I couldn't look away, even though every fiber of my being screamed for me to run, to leave and never return to that hallway. but I couldn't help myself. Something in me urged me to find the source of that light, to understand what it was, what it wanted. I slowly approached the door, my hand trembling as I reached for the handle. The moment my fingers touched the cool metal, the hum began again. Faint, but steady. It wasn't just a sound now, it was a vibration, a low rumble that seemed to reverberate in my bones. I pulled the door open. For a second, nothing happened. The light was gone. The room was as it had been before, dark, still, and empty. But the hum persisted, a low, constant sound filling the air around me. I stepped inside, my breath shallow as I looked around. The walls seemed to stretch farther than they should, as if the room itself was larger than I remembered. The light wasn't gone. It was inside the room now, but not in any way that made sense. It was coming from the walls themselves, seeping through the cracks like liquid gold. It pulsed in time with the hum, and with each pulse, the temperature in the room dropped, making my breath come out in cold puffs. I backed away, suddenly aware of the tightness in my chest. The room felt wrong. I couldn't explain it, but it was as if the air was thick with something that wasn't supposed to be there. I tried to step back toward the door, but my foot caught on something. I turned quickly, my eyes darting to the floor. A piece of paper was pinned to the ground, barely visible in the dim light. My heart skipped a beat. The paper was old, yellowed with age. The edges were frayed, as if it had been there for years. I bent down, reaching for it, my fingers brushing against the cold surface of the floor. As I lifted it, I saw the drawing. It was a child's drawing, simple, childish scrawl. But the image it depicted, it chilled me to the core. It was of a door, just like the one I had just opened, surrounded by dark, jagged shapes that seemed to reach for the door, clawing at it. Above the door, a figure was drawn, but it wasn't clear. It was just a shadow, long and twisted, its face hidden in the darkness. I felt my stomach turn. I couldn't explain it, but that drawing felt like it was meant for me. Like it had been left here for a reason. I stood up quickly, the paper still in my hand. The hum was growing louder now, vibrating the walls, shaking the very floor beneath my feet. I turned to leave, but the door was different. It was no longer just a door. It felt as though the room behind it had shifted, as though the boundaries between here and there had blurred. I turned back to the drawing, my mind racing. I knew I had to leave. I had to get out. But my legs wouldn't move. They were frozen, rooted to the spot, as if the room itself were holding me in place. The hum was now a deafening roar, and suddenly, the shadows from the walls seemed to stretch toward me, becoming something more than just darkness. They were figures, moving, shifting, like tendrils reaching out to claim me. A sound, sharp and metallic, rang through the room, and I spun around to find the source. But there was nothing. Just the walls, closing in. I was trapped. Then, I saw it. A figure standing in the doorway, faint, almost imperceptible at first. But as my eyes adjusted to the darkness, I saw it clearly. It was tall, too tall for a normal person, its limbs unnaturally long, twisted in ways they shouldn't have been. The figure didn't move, but it felt alive, watching me. Its face, if you could call it a face, was obscured, just a black void where eyes should have been. And then it spoke. It didn't use words. There was no sound, no voice. But somehow, I heard it. Felt it deep inside my skull. A thought, unbidden, swirling through my mind. You shouldn't have opened the door. I didn't understand, but the words lingered, echoing in my thoughts, growing louder, more insistent. I stumbled back, my heart racing, my breath coming in ragged gasps. The light was gone. The figure was gone. But I couldn't shake the feeling that it was still there, in the room, waiting for me to open the door again. I knew then that I had made a mistake, and there would be no turning back. I slammed the door shut behind me, my hands trembling as I fumbled with the lock. Not that it mattered. Whatever had been in that room didn't seem like it needed permission to enter. The moment the door clicked into place, the hum stopped. The air became still, unnervingly silent. I leaned against the wall, trying to catch my breath. The drawing was still in my hand, crumpled slightly from the way I had gripped it during my retreat. I smoothed it out on the counter, staring at the crude lines and unsettling shapes. The figure above the door haunted me. "What do you want?" I muttered under my breath, as if expecting an answer. And then I heard it, a faint whisper. It wasn't coming from the room behind the door. It was closer, impossibly close, as though it were coming from the walls themselves. At first, I thought it was the wind. Maybe the apartment building was settling, or maybe I had left a window open. But the whispers grew louder, more distinct. They weren't just noises, they were voices. I pressed my ear to the wall, half expecting to hear the muffled sounds of a neighbor's television or conversation. Instead, I heard words. "You opened it. You saw it. It sees you now." I stumbled back, my heart pounding so loudly I thought it might drown out the whispers. But they continued, relentless and unyielding. "Don't look. Don't listen. Too late." I clamped my hands over my ears, but it didn't help. The whispers weren't just sounds, they were in my head, crawling through my thoughts like insects. I rushed to the bathroom, desperate to get away from the sound. I turned on the faucet, letting the water run in an attempt to drown out the voices. The cold splash on my face did little to calm me, but for a moment the whispers seemed to fade. I looked up at the mirror, expecting to see my pale, exhaustive reflection staring back at me. Instead, the figure from the drawing loomed behind me, its shadowy form distorted and grotesque. I spun around, but the bathroom was empty. The voices returned, louder this time and more insistent. "It knows you. It will follow you. You can't hide." I stumbled out of the bathroom, my vision swimming. The hallway stretched longer than it should have, the walls bending and twisting as though the apartment were alive. The light under the door was back, but now it was brighter, pulsing erratically, casting long, jagged shadows across the floor. I grabbed my coat and keys, my mind screaming for me to leave. I didn't care where I went, I just needed to get out. As I reached the front door, the whispers turned into a deafening roar, a cacophony of overlapping voices that filled every corner of my mind. My hands shook as I struggled with the lock, the keys slipping from my fingers and clattering to the floor. And then, silence. The sudden absence of sound was almost more terrifying than the noise had been. It was the kind of silence that pressed against your chest, that made you feel small and insignificant. I turned back toward the hallway. The door to the empty room was open. Light poured out, blinding and unnatural, flooding the apartment with a brilliance that erased every shadow. And in the center of the doorway stood the figure. It didn't move. It didn't speak. But I could feel its gaze, cold and piercing, boring into me. I couldn't breathe. I couldn't think. And then it took a step forward. I froze, my back pressed against the front door, every muscle in my body refusing to respond. The figure in the light was indistinct, its edges shifting like smoke caught in a draft. Yet it was there, impossibly real, undeniably present. It took another step forward, the floor beneath its feet creaking as if in protest. The light surrounding it pulsed again, sending waves of nausea rolling through me. I couldn't look away, though every fiber of my being screamed at me to run. "Who? What are you?" My voice barely escaped as a whisper. The figure tilted its head, an almost human gesture, as if considering my question. Then, from deep within the blinding light, a voice emerged, not in words, but in a feeling. It wasn't sound, it was a pressure, an understanding pressed directly into my thoughts. "You opened the way." My knees buckled, and I slid to the floor, the cold metal of the keys beneath me the only thing anchoring me to reality. Opened the way? I hadn't opened anything. The light, the whispers, the figure, it was all happening to me, not because of me. Wasn't it? I reached out, blindly groping for the keys, desperate to grab hold of something tangible. My fingers closed around them, but the sensation was wrong. They were cold, too cold, and as I pulled my hand back, the keys seemed to shimmer, their metal surface twisting into something unrecognizable. The shapes looked familiar, though. They were turning into symbols. The same symbols from the drawing. "No," I muttered, shaking my head violently. "This isn't real. This can't be real." The light surged forward, and with it came the voices. Not whispers this time, but screams, children's screams. They echoed through the apartment, bouncing off the walls, filling the space with unbearable sound. "Don't fight it." The figure was closer now, standing just a few feet away. Its form was becoming clearer, more defined. I could see its face, or rather, the absence of one. Where its features should have been, there was only a void, a blackness that seemed to devour the light around it. And then it reached for me. I scrambled back, the hardwood of the front door pressing into my spine. My shaking hand found the doorknob, twisting and pulling with all the strength I had left. The door wouldn't budge. "Let me go!" I screamed, slamming my fists against the door. The figure's hand hovered inches from my face, its fingers impossibly long and thin, each tipped with a sharp, glimmering point. The light around it began to shift, its brilliance dimming just enough to reveal something terrifying. There was something inside the light. Shapes moved within it, too numerous and too fleeting to fully see, but I knew what they were. Faces. Dozens of faces, staring at me with hollow eyes, their mouths open in silent screams. I recognized some of them. From the news reports. From the missing posters around town. From the drawing. And then, as the figure's fingers brushed against my forehead, I saw something else. A vision, no, a memory. The room behind the door wasn't always empty. I saw myself, months ago, standing in that very room, holding the strange, faded key I had found in the basement. I saw myself turning it in the lock, the ancient door groaning as it swung open. And then I saw the light for the first time. I had opened the way. The memory shattered like glass, and I was back in the present, the figure looming over me. Its touch burned, not on my skin, but in my mind, searing through my thoughts like fire. But in that moment of pain, I realized something. If I had opened the way, then maybe, just maybe, I could close it. With a surge of adrenaline, I pushed past the figure, diving toward the hallway. The light was blinding, but I forced myself to keep going, my hands outstretched, searching for the door. The whispers and screams grew louder, clawing at my ears, but I didn't stop. Finally, my fingers found the doorknob. It was warm to the touch, almost scalding, but I didn't let go. I pulled the door shut with all my strength, the force of it slamming sending a shockwave through the apartment. The light vanished. The screams stopped. And I was alone in the dark. The silence was suffocating, pressing against my ears like a dense fog. I sat on the floor, my back against the cold wood of the door I had just slammed shut, struggling to catch my breath. The apartment was pitch black now, the faint glow from the streetlights outside unable to penetrate the suffocating darkness. I reached for the light switch on the wall beside me, my fingers fumbling in the dark. When I finally flipped it, nothing happened. The power was out. The room felt different, heavier, like the air had thickened. My hands trembled as I pushed myself up, leaning against the wall for support. Every instinct screamed at me to leave the apartment, to run and never look back. But my legs felt rooted to the spot, my body weighed down by exhaustion and fear. The door behind me remained closed, and I couldn't bring myself to turn around. I didn't want to see it again, didn't want to confirm that the faint, almost imperceptible hum was real. But I knew it was there, just as I knew I would never open it again. I stumbled toward the couch in the living room, collapsing onto it as my mind raced. The images of the faces in the light replayed over and over, their hollow eyes and screaming mouths seared into my memory. The realization that I had been the one to open the door in the first place weighed on me like a stone. How could I have forgotten? My thoughts were interrupted by a faint sound. At first, I thought it was the hum from the door, but then I recognized it, a soft, rhythmic tapping. It was coming from the window. I froze, every muscle in my body tensing as the tapping grew louder. Slowly, I turned my head toward the window. There, silhouetted against the faint glow of the streetlights, was a face. It was one of them. The hollow eyes stared directly at me, unblinking, unrelenting. Its mouth didn't move, but I heard the whispers again, faint and distant, like an echo in my mind. You can't keep it closed forever. The words sent a shiver down my spine. My hands gripped the edge of the couch, my knuckles turning white. The face didn't move, but I could feel its presence growing stronger, pressing against the window like a weight. I didn't know how long I sat there, paralyzed by fear. Minutes? Hours? Time lost all meaning. Finally, the face began to fade, dissolving into the night like smoke. But the whispers lingered, soft and persistent, fading only when the first light of dawn seeped through the cracks in the blinds. I didn't sleep that night. I couldn't. The next day, I packed a bag with whatever I could carry and left the apartment. I didn't bother to lock the door behind me. As I drove away, I told myself I was leaving it all behind, the door, the light, the whispers. But deep down, I knew the truth. Some things can't be left behind. Even now, in the quiet of my new home, I sometimes wake in the middle of the night, my heart racing. And in those moments, I swear I can hear it, the faint hum of a door I should have never opened. Have you ever come across something so strange, so out of place, that you couldn't ignore it? That's how it started for me. It was a quiet Thursday evening, the kind of night where the town seemed to hold its breath. I was driving home from work, my mind on autopilot, when I noticed it. A road. It wasn't supposed to be there. I'd driven this route for years, and I knew every turn, every crack in the pavement. But this road was new. It branched off from the main street, its surface unnaturally smooth, as if it had been paved just hours ago. No signs, no streetlights, no markings, just an endless stretch of asphalt disappearing into the horizon. I slowed down, curiosity tugging at me like an invisible hand. Something about it felt wrong. The air seemed heavier near the turnoff, the faint hum of crickets replaced by eerie silence. I told myself to keep driving, to forget about it. But as I passed the road, I caught a glimpse of something in my rearview mirror, a shadow, fleeting and indistinct, standing at the edge of the pavement. I slammed on the brakes, my heart pounding. When I looked back, the road was empty. That night, I couldn't sleep. The image of the shadow lingered in my mind, its shape shifting and blurring every time I tried to recall it. By morning, I had convinced myself it was nothing, a trick of the light, a tired mind playing games. But the road was still there the next day, and the day after that. By the end of the week, it had become an obsession. I asked around, but no one else seemed to notice it. My coworkers brushed it off, my neighbors shrugged, and even the town's oldest residents claimed they'd never seen it before. "You're overthinking it," my friend Mike said over coffee. "It's just a new road. Probably some construction project nobody told us about." But that didn't explain the way it made me feel, the oppressive weight in my chest, the sense that something was watching me whenever I got too close. I decided to investigate. On a crisp Saturday morning, armed with nothing but a flashlight and a stubborn need for answers, I parked my car at the edge of the road. The air was still, unnervingly quiet. No birds, no wind, just an unsettling silence that seemed to amplify every sound I made. I stepped onto the pavement, half expecting the ground to shift beneath me. It didn't. The surface was unnaturally smooth, almost too perfect. The road stretched out before me, flanked by dense woods on either side. It seemed endless, disappearing into a haze far in the distance. I started walking. At first, it felt like any other road, long, boring, unremarkable. But as I continued, I began to notice things. The trees lining the path weren't right. Their branches twisted unnaturally, the leaves a shade of green that seemed almost artificial. And the further I walked, the more the air seemed to change, growing colder and thicker, as if I were wading through an invisible fog. After what felt like hours, I looked back. The entrance was gone. Panic surged through me. The road behind me stretched on, identical to the one ahead. I tried to retrace my steps, but no matter how far I walked, the scenery didn't change. I was trapped. And then I heard it, a sound that sent a shiver down my spine. Footsteps. They were faint at first, barely audible over the deafening silence. But they grew louder, closer, each step echoing like a drumbeat in my ears. I turned, my flashlight cutting through the darkness, but there was nothing there. "Hello?" I called out, my voice trembling. No response. Just the footsteps, steady and deliberate, approaching from somewhere deep within the shadows. I started to run. The footsteps followed me, matching my pace no matter how fast I ran. My breath came in ragged gasps, and the flashlight in my hand trembled, its beam darting erratically across the endless stretch of road. "Stop!" I shouted, but I wasn't sure if I wanted them to listen. Part of me hoped I was imagining it, that I'd hear nothing if I paused. But the rhythmic sound didn't falter, the space between each step shrinking. I didn't dare look back. The road beneath my feet felt alive, its surface strangely warm, as though something pulsed just beneath it. The trees lining the path seemed to lean closer, their twisted branches clawing toward me, casting unnatural shadows that writhed like living things. And still, the footsteps came closer. Finally, I couldn't take it anymore. I spun around, flashlight raised, the beam cutting into the darkness. There was nothing there. I stood frozen, struggling to steady my breathing. The footsteps had stopped, the silence pressing down on me like a physical weight. But the air was wrong, charged with something I couldn't name. I wasn't alone. "Who's there?" I demanded, my voice shaking. The flashlight flickered, its light dimming momentarily before flaring back to life. In that brief moment, I saw it, a figure standing in the distance, just at the edge of the light. It was tall, impossibly thin, its features obscured by the shadows. Its head tilted unnaturally to one side, as if studying me. I stumbled back, my heart pounding. "Stay away!" The figure didn't move, but the air around it seemed to ripple, distorting like heat rising off asphalt. And then, slowly, it began to take a step forward. The flashlight flickered again, and when the beam steadied, the figure was closer. I turned and ran, my mind racing with thoughts of escape. But the road stretched endlessly ahead, the trees closing in around me. I didn't understand how I could have come so far, how this road could go on forever. The sound of footsteps returned, heavier this time, echoing like thunder. They didn't match mine anymore, they were deliberate, relentless, as though the figure was toying with me. I screamed, but the sound seemed to die in the air, swallowed by the oppressive silence of the path. Then I saw it, a faint glow ahead, a light that seemed to hover in the distance. Hope flared in my chest. I didn't know what it was, but it was something, and that was enough. I pushed myself harder, my legs burning, my lungs screaming for air. The light grew brighter, revealing a bend in the road, a curve that hadn't been there before. As I rounded the corner, the light consumed me, blinding and cold. I stumbled, falling to my knees, the flashlight slipping from my grasp and rolling away. When my vision cleared, I realized I wasn't on the road anymore. I was standing in a field, the grass stretching out in all directions under a sky that was neither night nor day. The air was thick, the silence so profound it made my ears ache. And then I saw them, figures scattered across the field, their forms motionless, their faces turned toward me. They were identical to the shadow I had seen on the road, their heads tilted at the same unnatural angle. I took a step back, but the ground beneath me shifted, pulling me closer. One of the figures raised its hand, pointing toward the horizon. And that's when I saw it, the road, stretching out ahead, beckoning me to continue. I wanted to scream, to turn and run in the opposite direction. But my feet moved on their own, carrying me back toward the endless path. Behind me, the figures began to follow. The road ahead seemed different now. Its surface shimmered faintly, as though reflecting light that wasn't there. My legs moved automatically, each step feeling heavier than the last. Behind me, the figures followed at an unnerving pace, not running, but gliding soundlessly, their heads still tilted, their dark silhouettes a constant reminder that escape was impossible. The air grew colder, and the silence around me was broken by a faint sound. It was soft at first, barely distinguishable from the rustling of the leaves. But as I walked, it grew louder, a chorus of whispers. They came from everywhere and nowhere, overlapping in a language I couldn't understand. The words were sharp, filled with urgency, their rhythm erratic. I covered my ears, but the whispers pressed on, burrowing into my mind like invasive thoughts. "Stop it!" I yelled, my voice echoing down the empty road. The whispers paused for a brief moment, leaving a void so profound it felt suffocating. And then, they spoke a single word, clear and deliberate: return. My heart raced as I looked around, desperate to find the source. But the figures behind me were still silent, their forms blending into the darkness. "What do you want from me?" I shouted. The road seemed to shift under my feet, and I stumbled. The edges of the path blurred, as if the trees and shadows were melting together. Panic gripped me as the road narrowed, leaving no room to stray from its path. The whispers resumed, louder now, repeating the same word over and over: return. 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 Return where? I didn't understand. I tried to stop walking, to turn back, but my body refused to listen. The road compelled me forward, each step a battle against an unseen force. As I struggled, the shadows around me deepened, and the road began to change. It was no longer smooth asphalt, but a cracked and uneven surface, covered in strange, intricate symbols. They pulsed faintly, like embers, and the air around them felt charged with electricity. The whispers became voices, distinct, pleading, angry. Some called my name. Others laughed, their tones mocking. I looked ahead and saw something in the distance. It was a door, standing alone in the middle of the road. Its surface was covered in the same glowing symbols, and a faint light seeped from its edges. The sight filled me with both hope and dread. Was this the end of the road, or just another trap? I quickened my pace, desperate for answers. As I approached the door, the figures behind me slowed, their forms dissolving into the shadows. The voices, however, grew louder, screaming now, their words jumbled and incomprehensible. I reached out and touched the door. It was cold, impossibly so, and the symbols flared under my hand. The light around the edges grew brighter, blinding me. The door creaked open, revealing nothing but darkness on the other side. "Step through," a voice whispered, clear and close, as if it came from right behind me. I turned, but there was no one there. The road had disappeared. The field was gone. I was standing in a void, the door the only thing that remained. "Step through," the voice repeated, firmer this time. I hesitated, every instinct screaming at me to turn back. But there was no back. The path was gone, the world erased. Taking a deep breath, I stepped through the door and into the unknown. The moment I stepped through the door, the air changed. It was thicker, heavier, pressing against my skin like an invisible weight. Darkness enveloped me, absolute and suffocating. For a moment, I thought I had gone blind. Then, faint glimmers began to emerge, like stars piercing a night sky. They hovered in the distance, shifting and flickering as though alive. The whispers returned, softer this time, more rhythmic, almost like a chant. They guided me forward, their cadence pulling me deeper into the void. The ground beneath my feet felt strange, neither solid nor liquid, but something in between. With every step, the glimmers grew brighter, forming shapes I couldn't quite comprehend. They twisted and spiraled, rearranging themselves into patterns that hurt to look at. Ahead of me, a figure materialized. Unlike the silent shadows on the road, this one glowed faintly, its form indistinct but undeniably human. "Who are you?" I asked, my voice sounding small in the vast emptiness. The figure tilted its head, mirroring the motion of the shadows from before. Then it spoke, its voice layered and echoing, as if 100 people were speaking at once. "You saw at the end of the road." "I didn't mean to," I stammered. I needed to know." The figure moved closer, and I instinctively stepped back. Its presence was overwhelming, its glow casting long, shifting shadows that seemed to ripple across the void. Curiosity brought you here, it said, as it has brought many before you. But the road does not end. It only changes. I glanced behind me, hoping to see the door, the faintest sign of an escape. But it was gone, swallowed by the darkness. What is this place? I demanded. What do you want from me? The figure raised a hand, and the whispers ceased. Silence fell, thick and oppressive, as the patterns of light around us coalesced into a single, towering shape, a doorway. You stand at a threshold, the figure said. To cross is to embrace what lies beyond. To turn back is to leave a piece of yourself behind. Its words sent a chill through me. Leave a piece of myself? The figure nodded, its form flickering. The road takes as much as it gives. Those who walk it are never whole again. My mind raced, searching for meaning in its cryptic words. What happens if I don't cross? If I stay here? The figure didn't answer immediately. When it finally spoke, its tone was almost gentle. The void will take you. Slowly, completely. Until you are nothing. Panic surged through me. My choices were clear: step through the new doorway or be consumed by the emptiness. The whispers returned, faint and pleading, urging me to move forward. But something in me resisted. What's on the other side? I asked, my voice shaking. The figure's glow dimmed slightly. What you seek. What you fear. What you cannot escape. It gestured toward the doorway, its light illuminating a faint outline of another path. I stared at the door, the weight of its presence bearing down on me. My instincts screamed to run, but there was nowhere to go. Taking a shaky breath, I stepped toward the doorway. The figure remained motionless, its gaze, or whatever semblance of it, fixed on me. As I reached the threshold, I hesitated, one last question bubbling to the surface. Will I ever find my way back? The figure's form shimmered, and for a brief moment, I thought I saw something human in its glow. The road only moves forward, it said. With that, I stepped through, the doorway swallowing me whole. Darkness gave way to blinding light, and the whispers erupted into a deafening roar. And then, there was silence. When the light faded, I found myself standing on the same road, or so it seemed. The air felt familiar, the scent of damp asphalt and distant rain clinging to the atmosphere. But something was different. The world around me was distorted, as though viewed through a warped lens. Trees lined the edges of the road, their branches twisting unnaturally toward the sky. Shadows flickered and danced in the periphery, though the source of light was absent. I took a step forward, the ground beneath me solid but unnervingly cold. Each step echoed, the sound unnaturally loud in the stillness. Is this the other side? I murmured, my voice barely audible. The road stretched endlessly ahead, just as before. There were no landmarks, no signs of civilization, only the infinite gray of the path and the encroaching darkness of the forest. Suddenly, the whispers returned, but now they were clearer, distinct voices murmuring in unison. I couldn't understand their words, but their tone was insistent, urging me to move forward. I quickened my pace, the whispers growing louder with every step. They pressed against my mind, filling it with fragmented images, faces I didn't recognize, places I'd never been, and moments I couldn't remember. Stop it! I shouted, clutching my head. The whispers paused, replaced by an eerie silence. And then I saw it, a figure standing in the middle of the road. Unlike the shadows and shapes from before, this figure was vivid, solid. It was a man, dressed in a tattered coat, his face obscured by the brim of a wide hat. "Who are you?" I called out, my voice trembling. The man raised his head, revealing hollow eyes that glowed faintly. "You've come far," he said, his voice deep and resonant. "What is this place?" I demanded. "Why am I here?" He tilted his head, his expression unreadable. "You sought the road. Now the road seeks you." I took a cautious step closer, my heart pounding. "What does that mean?" "I didn't ask for this." The man's gaze bore into me, unblinking. "No one asks. Yet all arrive. The road chooses those who cannot turn away." His words chilled me to my core. "How do I leave?" A faint smile touched his lips, but it wasn't comforting. "There is no leaving. There is only moving forward." Desperation surged within me. "Then what's at the end?" "There has to be an end." The man stepped aside, gesturing toward the path ahead. "Walk. See for yourself." I hesitated, my instinct screaming at me to turn and run, but I knew there was no going back. The road behind me had already faded into darkness. With no other choice, I moved past him, my steps slow and tentative. The whispers resumed, softer now, like a distant hum. As I walked, the air grew heavier, the trees closing on either side. The road began to change, its surface cracking and crumbling, revealing an endless void beneath. I glanced back, but the man was gone. Ahead, the path narrowed, leading to a single point of light in the distance. Hope flared within me. Perhaps this was it, the end, the way out. I broke into a run, the whispers growing louder, their tone shifting to something urgent, almost panicked. The light grew closer, brighter, until it consumed everything. I stepped into it, my breath catching as the ground disappeared beneath me. And then I was falling, the world around me dissolving into fragments of color and sound. When I landed, the impact jolted me awake. I was back in my room, the morning sun streaming through the window. For a moment, relief washed over me. It was over. But as I sat up, I froze. My feet were coated in dust, the same strange, gray substance that had lined the endless road. And on the wall, scrawled in faint, jagged letters, was a single phrase. "The road never ends." What would you do if a book could reveal the story of your life before it even happened? It began on an ordinary Tuesday. The rain drummed steadily against the windows of my apartment, and the air carried the faint scent of damp wood. I had spent the morning wandering through the local flea market, searching for something, anything, to distract me from the monotony of my days. That's when I saw it, a small, unassuming book lying on a cluttered table. Its leather cover was cracked with age, and the faint impression of an emblem was barely visible on its surface. No title, no author, nothing to suggest its purpose or origin. Interested? The vendor's voice startled me. He was an older man, his face lined with years and his eyes sharp with curiosity. "How much?" I asked, picking up the book. "$5, he said with a shrug. "It's just an old journal, empty pages. But some folks like that sort of thing." I paid him and left, clutching my purchase tightly. Something about the book intrigued me, though I couldn't explain why. Back home, I set the book on my desk and stared at it. It was heavier than it looked, and the leather felt strangely warm under my fingers. I opened it, expecting to find blank pages. And I did. At first. The pages were yellowed and slightly rough to the touch, but otherwise unremarkable. I flipped through them, one by one, until I reached the end. Nothing. No hidden notes, no faint impressions of writing, just empty pages. Disappointed, I set it aside and went about my day. That night, however, something changed. As I sat at my desk, scrolling mindlessly through my laptop, my eyes were drawn to the book. It seemed to catch the light differently, as though the leather glowed faintly. I reached for it, my heart inexplicably racing. When I opened it this time, there was writing. Faint, almost imperceptible lines of text scrawled across the first page. The ink was dark and uneven, as though written in haste. I leaned closer, my breath catching as I read. You found me today at the market. You were drawn to me, though you didn't know why. Now, your story begins. I froze, the words echoing in my mind. This wasn't possible. The page had been blank before, hadn't it? I flipped through the other pages, but they remained empty. The first page, however, stared back at me with its haunting message. What is this? I whispered, my voice trembling. The next day, the book was still on my desk. The writing remained unchanged. I debated throwing it away, but something held me back. Curiosity, perhaps. Or fear. As the hours passed, I found myself unable to focus on anything else. The book seemed to hum with an unseen energy, drawing me closer. Finally, I couldn't resist. I opened it again. This time, more text had appeared. You're reading these words now, wondering if this is a trick or a coincidence. It's neither. The story is yours. And it's far from over. The words were sharp and precise, as though etched into the page rather than written. A cold shiver ran down my spine. That night, I dreamed of the book. In my dream, its pages turned on their own, revealing scenes from my life. Some were familiar, memories I recognized. Others were strange, events that hadn't happened yet. When I woke, the book was open on my desk, though I was certain I had closed it before going to bed. A new entry awaited me, the ink fresh and vivid. Your path has been set. There's no turning back now. I stared at the words, my pulse pounding in my ears. What had I brought into my life? And what would happen if I kept reading? The next day felt surreal. Everywhere I went, I couldn't stop thinking about the book. Its words echoed in my mind, a strange mixture of curiosity and dread clawing at my thoughts. I tried to distract myself. I went for a walk, wandered through the park, and even visited the coffee shop where I usually found solace in the hum of conversations. But nothing worked. The book's presence loomed over me like a shadow. When I returned home, it was waiting. Sitting exactly where I had left it, the book seemed to radiate a silent challenge, as if it knew I couldn't resist. I hesitated before opening it, my fingers brushing over the worn leather. My heart pounded as I turned the cover and stared at the first page. The text had changed again. You cannot ignore me. Your story is already being written, whether you choose to see it or not. I flipped to the second page. For the first time, ink adorned its surface. Tonight, you will learn the truth. But beware, knowledge comes at a cost. A cold chill ran down my spine. I slammed the book shut, breathing heavily. What does this mean? I whispered to the empty room. The book offered no answers, its silence unnerving. I tried to ignore it, leaving it on the desk as I busied myself with mundane tasks. But the hours ticked by, and the sense of unease only grew stronger. Night fell, and with it came the silence. A suffocating stillness settled over my apartment, broken only by the ticking of the clock. Unable to resist any longer, I returned to the book. This time, I noticed something different. The edges of the pages shimmered faintly, like a heat haze. I opened it to the first blank page. The moment I did, the lights in my apartment flickered. The ink appeared slowly, letter by letter, as though an invisible hand were writing before my eyes. Do you see now? The words aren't just ink. They're alive, just as you are. And tonight, the two will intertwine. What are you? I demanded, my voice shaking. What do you want from me? The next line appeared instantly, as though anticipating my question. I am not the question. You are. And the answer lies ahead. The room grew colder, the air heavy with an unexplainable weight. I backed away, but the book seemed to pull me closer, an invisible force tugging at my will. Then, a sound broke the silence, a soft rustling, like paper being torn. I turned, searching for its source, but the room was empty. When I looked back at the book, the pages were turning themselves. They stopped abruptly on a page near the middle. There, written in bold letters, was a single command. Look behind you. I froze, my body paralyzed with fear. The room seemed darker, the shadows deeper. Slowly, against my better judgment, I turned. Nothing. Just the empty room. But as I exhaled in relief, a faint sound reached my ears, a whisper. Soft, unintelligible, but undeniably real. It came from the book. I looked down to see a new line of text forming. The first price has been paid. Now, the story continues. The whispering grew louder, swirling around me like 1,000 voices overlapping. Panic surged through me, and I slammed the book shut. The whispers stopped instantly, leaving the room eerily silent once more. I stumbled back, my hands trembling. What had I unleashed? The book sat there, motionless yet menacing, as if waiting for me to take the next step. I didn't sleep that night. Every creak of the floorboards, every distant hum of the city outside, set my nerves on edge. By morning, the book remained closed, but its presence lingered in the air. I knew I couldn't avoid it forever. Somehow, I was part of its story now. And whatever came next, there was no escaping it. I didn't know how much time had passed when I finally gathered the courage to open the book again. It was the third day since the words had appeared, and I still felt the weight of their meaning. The book had remained silent, almost dormant, as if it, too, were waiting for me to make a choice. The air in the apartment felt thick with tension. Every inch of the room seemed to echo with a deep, unnatural quiet. I sat down at the desk, my fingers trembling as I lifted the book's cover. It felt heavier than before, almost as though it had absorbed the darkness of the last few days. The first page was blank, just as it had been when I first opened it. But as I stared at the empty space, the words began to form before my eyes, slow and deliberate. You've waited long enough. Now, the end draws near. I gasped, recoiling from the page. My pulse quickened, and I could almost feel my heart beating louder than before, echoing in my ears. The book, it was speaking to me again. It wasn't just telling me things, it was controlling them. You seek to understand, but some truths are meant to remain buried. To follow this path is to risk losing yourself. The ink seemed to bleed across the page, spreading out like tendrils, as if the book itself was alive, constantly shifting. Each word curled and writhed, as though trying to escape the confines of its own pages. "Why?" I whispered, almost pleading. The response was immediate. "Because you've already started. You've already crossed the line, and now there is no turning back." The words faded, leaving me in the silence once again. My hands were shaking as I turned the page, only to be met with the same eerie emptiness. But I couldn't stop now. Something inside me, something dark and insistent, urged me to keep going. I flipped to the next page. The words that appeared there sent a chill through me. "Your life is no longer your own. The story has begun, and you are but a character. I write your every move." I closed my eyes, forcing myself to breathe, to regain control. I had to stay calm. I had to understand what was happening. But the longer I stared at the page, the more it seemed like the words were seeping into my mind, filling it with an overwhelming sense of dread. I tried to leave the room, to run. But when I stood up, my legs felt heavy, as though I were wading through deep water. It was as though the book had its hold on me, and the closer I got to the door, the more I felt trapped in its web. I turned back to the desk, my body unwillingly drawn to it. My hands moved, almost against my will, to open the book once more. It was different this time. The words weren't forming on the pages, they were already there, written in a neat, elegant script. You can't escape what's already been set in motion. Every step you take, every breath you draw, is part of the story I write. I felt the room spin around me. The walls seemed to close in, the air growing thinner with each passing second. It was as if the very fabric of reality was unraveling, thread by thread. A loud bang echoed from the door, followed by a scratching sound, like claws dragging across the wood. My breath hitched, and I turned to face it. There was no one there. But something was watching me. I could feel it. The book continued its cruel narration. "They are coming. The ones who belong to the story. The ones who you cannot escape." I reached for the pages, desperately trying to shut the book, but the words wouldn't stop. They kept flowing, faster now, as if the story was accelerating, as if it were alive and feeding on my fear. And then I saw it, a shadow moving just outside the window. It was vague at first, like a ripple in the air, but it grew clearer with each passing second. A figure, dark and hunched, its face obscured by the night. It moved closer, closer to the apartment, and I felt my stomach drop. The book spoke again, its voice cold and distant. "It's too late. They are here. They know your name. They know your fate." I slammed the book shut, my hands numb from the cold dread that had settled in my chest. The shadow outside stopped. I could feel its eyes on me, even from beyond the glass. But it wasn't just the shadow that terrified me. It was the realization that the book knew things it shouldn't, things that hadn't happened yet, things I hadn't even thought of. And then, there it was, a knock on the door. The sound was heavy, final, as though it had been written into the script of my life. I didn't know what to do. I wanted to run, but where could I go? The book had already rewritten everything. There was nowhere left to hide. Slowly, I moved toward the door, my hand hovering over the knob. I could feel the weight of the world pressing against me, urging me to open it, to face whatever waited on the other side. But I knew that once I opened that door, there would be no turning back. I took a deep breath. The story wasn't over. It had only just begun. The door stood before me, looming like a blackened void. The knock came again, louder this time, more insistent. My hand froze, hovering above the handle. My heart pounded in my chest as I stared at the wood, willing myself not to move. I could almost hear the words from the book echoing in my mind. They are here. They know your name. But who were they? The ones the book had spoke of? The shadow outside the window? The ones whose eyes I could feel even though I couldn't see them clearly? I took a shaky breath and forced myself to turn the knob. The door creaked open with a sound that sent a ripple of terror down my spine. On the other side, there was no one. Just darkness. I stepped forward, my body tense, ready to react at the slightest sound. The hall outside was eerily quiet, too quiet, and the dim light from the street lamp outside cast long shadows that seemed to shift and writhe like living things. I took a step into the hallway, my feet barely making a sound on the worn floorboards. The air felt thick with an unnatural cold, and I could almost taste the fear that hung in the air. I could hear my own breath, shallow and ragged, filling the silence as I moved cautiously forward. Every instinct screamed at me to turn back, to lock the door, to ignore the whispers of the book. But I couldn't. I had to know. I had to find out what the book was trying to tell me. What was its purpose? And what had it set in motion? I reached the end of the hallway. The apartment complex felt hollow, as though it were empty, as though I were the last person left. The floor beneath my feet creaked again, louder this time, like someone, or something, was following me. But when I turned, there was nothing there. Except the shadow. It was at the end of the hallway now, just beyond the reach of the light. The figure I had seen outside the window stood motionless, its form blacker than the night, as though it were made from the darkness itself. I couldn't see its face, but I could feel its eyes, boring into me with an intensity that paralyzed me. The book's words returned to me, cold and certain. They know your name. They know your fate. And then, as if on cue, a gust of wind blew through the hall, causing the shadows to shift. The temperature dropped even further, the air biting at my skin. The shadow moved, a slow, deliberate motion that seemed to be pulling me in. You can't escape, the book whispered. You are already part of the story. I wanted to scream. I wanted to run. But my feet wouldn't move. My mind was trapped in the nightmare the book had woven. And the shadow, it was getting closer. A whisper filled the air, soft at first, but growing louder with each passing second. It was a voice, deep and hollow, as though it came from far away. You cannot escape the path. I closed my eyes, my hands trembling. The shadow was inches away now, its presence suffocating. My breath caught in my throat as a cold, invisible hand seemed to reach for me. The book had warned me. It had told me there was no escape. But why did I still feel like I had to fight? Why couldn't I just accept the inevitable? Then, a flicker of light. The dim glow from the street lamp outside seemed to grow brighter for a moment, casting strange shapes and patterns across the walls. The shadow hesitated. It was as if the light itself had a power over it. I took a step back, my pulse racing. I couldn't stay in the hallway with the shadow. No, I couldn't stay in this apartment at all. There was no safety here. No escape. I turned and ran back down the hallway, past the open door of my apartment, and toward the staircase. My feet moved without thinking, my mind consumed by panic. The shadow did not follow me. But I could feel it, its presence lingering just out of sight, waiting for the moment when I would falter. I reached the stairs and took them two at a time, my breath ragged, the echo of my footsteps the only sound in the dead silence. The apartment complex seemed to stretch on forever, as though it was becoming an endless labyrinth. The further I ran, the more disorienting the space became. The hallways twisted unnaturally, doors appeared where there had been none, and each turn seemed to lead to more darkness. The light from the stairwell flickered as I descended, casting long, distorted shadows that seemed to stretch toward me. And then, I heard it. A voice, low and raspy, whispering my name. I froze. You cannot outrun the story. I turned, but there was nothing there. No shadow. No figure. Just the hollow emptiness of the staircase. But I knew, deep down, that it wasn't just the physical space that was shifting. It was the very fabric of my life. The book had already begun to write my fate. And no matter where I went, I was trapped in its pages. A final whisper reached my ears, and I knew it was the last thing I would ever hear. You are the story now. With a jolt, everything went dark. I woke up in darkness. My eyes fluttered open, but there was nothing to see. No light. No sound. Just the overwhelming stillness that pressed down on me like a heavy blanket. The kind of silence that made my skin crawl, the kind that was too thick, too complete. I tried to move, but my body felt like it was made of stone. My limbs were heavy, unresponsive. Panic began to claw at my chest. I opened my mouth to scream, but no sound escaped. What had happened? Where was I? The last thing I remembered was the whisper, the final words, "You are the story now." The darkness shifted. Not in any physical way, but in a strange, intangible way. It was like the shadows themselves were watching me. Waiting. Then, just as suddenly as the silence had consumed me, something changed. A faint light appeared, just a sliver at first, barely perceptible, like the glow of a dying candle. It flickered, casting distorted shapes on the walls, shapes that didn't quite make sense. I forced my body to move, to stand. My legs buckled beneath me at first, but I steadied myself, my hands gripping the cold, hard ground beneath me. Slowly, I pushed myself up, the light growing brighter as I moved toward it. As I stepped forward, the space around me seemed to stretch, shifting and warping. The walls, if they could even be called walls, seemed to bend, their angles impossibly sharp and unnatural. The air around me was thick, stifling. My breath felt like it was being sucked away by some unseen force. I could feel the book's presence, somehow, even though I hadn't seen it in what felt like days. The weight of its existence pressed down on me. It had written my life, my every move, and now I was part of the story. The light in front of me brightened, and I could make out the outlines of a door. It was old, worn, with a tarnished brass handle. I reached for it, my hand shaking as I gripped the cool metal. The moment my fingers touched the door, I heard it. A sound so faint, I almost missed it. The soft rustle of pages turning. I recoiled, my heart racing. The book. It was still writing. But what was it writing now? Was this the end of my story? Or had it just begun? I opened the door, and what I saw made my blood run cold. Beyond it, there was nothing. Not darkness, not light. Just a blank, endless void. And in the center of it, suspended in midair, was a single page. The page from the book. My page. I reached out instinctively, my hand trembling, and the page shifted like it was alive. The words began to appear, slowly at first, then faster, filling the space with ink as if the story was being written before my very eyes. He had come to the end of the road, but the end was just the beginning. I stumbled back, my breath coming in ragged gasps. The page was still there, its words forming, one sentence at a time, as if they were meant just for me. I couldn't move, couldn't look away. But then, something shifted. The words stopped, and a new line appeared. And so, he opened the door again. I stood frozen, staring at the words. They were a command. A sentence that demanded my action. It was no longer just a book writing my life. It was telling me what to do. And I had no choice but to obey. I turned around, facing the void once more. The door that had brought me here was still behind me, but there was no going back. I could feel the weight of the decision pressing down on me. You cannot outrun the story, the voice whispered again, distant but clear. I stepped forward, into the void. The page faded away as I did, the last trace of the story vanishing like dust in the wind. There was nothing left but me and the path ahead. As I walked, I could hear the pages turning again, faster now, the story unfolding faster than I could follow. The book was still writing, still controlling me. I could feel it, deep in my bones, shaping every step, every breath, every thought. I had become the story. There was no escape. No end. Just the endless, inevitable march of the narrative that I could no longer control. And somewhere, far in the distance, I could hear a voice, soft, but unmistakable. The end is only the beginning. And in that moment, I knew the story would never end. It started with a simple question. What is that sound? At first, it was barely noticeable. A faint melody drifting through my window every night. I could never quite catch the tune, but I knew it was there. Soft, gentle notes, as if the wind itself had picked up a forgotten song. It was comforting, almost soothing, like the distant hum of a lullaby. I thought little of it. I live alone in a small apartment on the second floor of an old building. The kind where the walls creak and the floors groan under the weight of time. The kind of place you'd expect to find a long-forgotten tune escaping the cracks. So when I first heard it, I shrugged it off. Perhaps it was the wind. Or maybe one of my neighbors practicing an instrument late at night. I wasn't bothered by it at all. But night after night, the melody persisted. It became a regular occurrence, almost like a companion. I would lie in bed, staring at the ceiling, and listen as the faint sound of music drifted through the cracks of my old window. Every night, at the same time, the melody would play, rising in volume just enough to fill the room with its eerie sweetness. Soon, I noticed a pattern. The melody wasn't just something I heard in the dead of night. No, it began to follow me. It crept into my days, a soft hum lingering in the background of my life. It was as if the sound had taken on a life of its own, like it was tethered to me, weaving its notes around my thoughts. I first noticed it while walking through the city. It was there, just out of reach, like a song stuck in my head. But I couldn't remember ever hearing it during the day. It was disorienting. My footsteps faltered for a moment, and I stopped on the sidewalk, scanning the streets for the source. Nothing. No musicians. No street performers. Only the ordinary hum of traffic and the buzz of daily life. Yet, the melody continued, rising and falling like a faint whisper in my ear. At first, I thought it was my imagination. Perhaps I was becoming paranoid. But it wasn't long before the melody followed me into my home. I'd hear it while making breakfast, or as I sat at my desk, working. The notes were no longer confined to the night. They invaded my waking hours, filling the empty spaces between thoughts and actions. The music became a constant presence, an invisible force I couldn't escape. And then, something began to change. It was subtle at first, like the softest edge of a nightmare creeping up on me. One afternoon, as I sat by the window with a cup of coffee, I noticed the melody growing louder. At first, it was just an increase in volume. But then, the notes started to shift. They grew sharper, more distinct. They no longer blended into the background. They began to demand my attention. The melody twisted, like a voice calling me, beckoning me towards something I couldn't see. I began to feel uneasy. My skin would prickle whenever the music started, and my thoughts would scatter. I tried to block it out, but the more I tried to ignore it, the more insistent it became. The melody wasn't just a sound anymore. It felt alive, as if it had a purpose, as if it was waiting for something. I couldn't tell anyone. How could I? How could I explain a haunting melody that only I could hear? It wasn't like anything I had ever experienced before. And as the days passed, I began to feel the weight of it. The music wasn't just following me, it was consuming me. I tried to shut my window, hoping that the sound would stay outside. But it still found its way inside. It seeped under the door, through the cracks in the walls. It followed me wherever I went. And every night, it would return. Each time it felt closer, more present. It was like the melody had become a part of me, entwined with my every breath, my every thought. I couldn't sleep. I couldn't concentrate. My life, once simple and quiet, was being swallowed by the music. I had no idea how much longer I could take it. The melody was driving me mad. It wasn't until one fateful evening that I realized the true nature of the sound. I had been pacing around my apartment, trying to block out the music, when I heard something different. The melody was no longer just a soft hum or a distant tune. It had become a voice that whispered my name. It wasn't a sound that echoed from the street anymore. It was right there, in the room with me. At first, I thought I had imagined it. But then, it called to me again. My name, soft and drawn out, like the wind itself was speaking to me. I froze, paralyzed by the sound. It was the first time I had ever felt truly afraid of it. The music wasn't just haunting me, it was speaking to me. But what did it want? I glanced nervously at the window, as if expecting to see something or someone outside. But there was nothing. Just the dark, empty street below. Then, slowly, the melody began to grow louder again, more insistent. The voice became clearer, no longer just a whisper, but a command. I had to know what it was. Where was it coming from? Who was behind it? But as I reached for the door, ready to confront whatever this was, the music stopped. The silence was absolute. Complete. And for the first time in days, I felt free. The weight of the melody lifted, leaving me in an eerie calm. But deep down, I knew it wasn't over. I don't know how long I stood there, frozen in place, my hand hovering over the door. The silence around me was suffocating, like the air had thickened, pressing in from every direction. The melody had stopped, and for a brief moment, I thought I was free. But I knew better. Something had changed. The music, the whispers, the feeling that something was lurking just beyond my reach, it hadn't disappeared. It was still there, just waiting, like a predator pausing before the hunt. I pulled myself away from the door, my legs feeling heavy as I walked back to the center of the room. I glanced nervously around the apartment, half expecting the melody to start again. The stillness was almost worse than the sound had been. It was as if the air itself was holding its breath, waiting for something to happen. I sat down at my desk, trying to distract myself. I picked up a book, flipping through the pages absent-mindedly. But every few seconds, my eyes darted toward the window, my ears straining for even the faintest trace of the melody. But nothing came. Hours passed, but the silence stretched on. It was almost unbearable. As the night deepened, I found myself growing restless. I couldn't sit still. I paced around the room, pulling at the collar of my shirt, feeling the tightness in my chest. Something was wrong. I knew it. I could feel it. I tried to push the thoughts aside, tried to convince myself that it was just my imagination running wild. After all, I hadn't seen anything, no strange figures lurking outside, no sudden movements in the shadows. Just the music. Just the voice calling my name. It was all just a trick, a play of the mind, nothing more. But deep down, I knew the truth. The music had stopped, yes, but it wasn't gone. It was still there, buried beneath the surface, waiting for me to make a mistake, to let my guard down. I couldn't ignore it any longer. I stood up abruptly, a decision forming in my mind. I had to find out where it was coming from. I had to understand what was behind the melody. And the only way to do that was to confront it head on. I grabbed my coat and left the apartment. The cold night air hit me immediately, biting at my skin as I stepped out onto the quiet street. The city was strangely still, as if the world itself was holding its breath, waiting for something to happen. I didn't see anyone else out. No cars, no people walking. Just the distant hum of the city, and in the distance, the faintest echo of the melody. It was there, just like it had been every night before. But now, it seemed even more distinct, like it was closer. I could hear the rhythm of the music, a slow, haunting progression of notes that seemed to curl around me, following me as I walked. I couldn't escape it. I tried to block it out, but it was impossible. The melody wrapped around me, tugging at my thoughts, pulling me forward. I tried to ignore the feeling creeping up my spine, the chill that spread through my bones as I walked deeper into the night. I didn't know where I was going. It didn't matter. All that mattered was the sound. The music was my only guide now. I had to follow it. And so I did. I walked for what felt like hours, the melody never leaving my side. It didn't matter where I went or how far I walked, it was always there, just ahead, just behind. I could feel it pressing in on me, suffocating me. The world around me seemed to blur, the lines between reality and the haunting melody growing increasingly uncertain. I turned a corner, and for a brief moment, I thought I saw something. A figure, standing in the shadows of an alley. It was barely there, just a silhouette, but it was enough to send a shiver down my spine. I stopped, my heart racing, the melody becoming louder, more insistent. "Hello?" I called out, my voice trembling. No answer. Just the faint, distant sound of the music, growing louder. I stepped forward cautiously, my eyes scanning the darkness. But the figure was gone. In its place, only the empty alley stretched ahead of me. I turned around quickly, suddenly aware of how alone I was. I had walked so far, deeper into the city, farther than I had ever gone before. It felt like the walls were closing in on me, like the night itself was swallowing me whole. And then, just as I was about to turn back, the melody shifted. It was no longer just a sound. It was a command. The notes twisted, forming words, whispering through the air in a voice that was unmistakably familiar. My name. Come closer. I froze, my blood running cold. It was no longer the same soft, distant voice from before. It was closer now, sharper. It was as if the melody had taken shape, like the music itself was alive, reaching out to me. I could hear it, feel it, deep in my bones. But before I could make a move, something shifted. The streetlights flickered above me, casting long, strange shadows across the pavement. And then I saw it, standing in front of me, blocking my path. A figure, its features obscured by darkness. A shadow, tall and unnaturally still. I couldn't breathe. I couldn't move. The melody was now deafening, filling my head, drowning out everything else. My hands shook as I tried to step back, but the figure didn't move. It was as if it was waiting for me. Come closer, the voice repeated, louder now, almost demanding. And then, the world around me shifted again, the music swallowing the street, the shadows closing in. I had no choice but to move forward, to face whatever was waiting for me. I couldn't look away. The figure was right in front of me now, so close I could almost feel the weight of its presence, though I still couldn't make out any details of its face. It was as if the darkness itself had taken shape, wrapping itself around the figure like a shroud. The melody, louder now, twisted through my mind, pulling me in. It wasn't just sound anymore, it was like a command. An unyielding force, demanding that I approach. The more I resisted, the louder the music became, each note sharper, more insistent. It was as if my very thoughts were being drowned out by the sound. I took a step back, but my feet felt heavy. I couldn't move quickly enough, couldn't tear my gaze away from the figure that blocked my path. I felt my heart hammering in my chest, the echo of my pulse rising in sync with the rhythm of the melody. Please, I whispered, my voice barely audible over the sound. What do you want from me? There was no answer. The figure just stood there, unmoving, silent, almost too still, like it wasn't entirely real. A flicker of doubt crossed my mind. Was it an illusion? Some twisted figment of my imagination brought on by the endless, haunting melody? No. I couldn't afford to dismiss it as a trick of the mind. It was too real, too present. And I knew, deep down, that the answer lay ahead of me. I had to move forward, despite the dread that curled in my gut. The voice in the music whispered again, "Come closer," but this time it wasn't a command, it was a plea. I didn't understand. What was it asking for? What could it possibly want from me? I reached out a trembling hand, instinctively, as if my body had already made the decision for me. The moment my fingers brushed the air in front of the figure, something changed. The world around me seemed to slow, the melody fading for a brief instant before picking up again, more chaotic than before. And then I saw it, like a wave, the figure began to distort. It was no longer a shadow, but a collection of twisting shapes, moving and shifting in ways that defied logic. I could feel it pulling at my mind, the melody becoming a dissonant, painful jangle of notes, filling every corner of my thoughts. I staggered backward, my breath caught in my throat. It was too much. The sensation of the figure's presence, the music, it was suffocating. And then, as suddenly as it had appeared, the figure was gone. The alley was empty once more. The streetlights flickered, casting eerie shadows across the pavement, and for a split second, I wondered if everything had been some horrible illusion, a product of too much stress, too many sleepless nights. But the melody was still there. I clutched my head in my hands, trying to push the sound out of my mind, but it wouldn't stop. The melody, once beautiful and soft, was now jarring and violent, each note like a sharp blade scraping against my thoughts. I couldn't escape it, couldn't shut it out. And then it happened again. A figure, not the same as before, but similar, began to take shape in front of me. Slowly, it emerged from the darkness, standing at the edge of the alley. The same cold, hollow presence surrounded it. But this time, I could see it more clearly. The figure was not human, not truly. It was a distortion of something that once had been, something twisted and wrong. I could hear the music shift again, becoming slower, deliberate, as if the figure was leading me toward it. The melody was its own language now, its notes weaving in and out of my thoughts like a conversation I didn't understand. "Why are you doing this?" I asked, my voice shaking. The figure didn't respond, but I could feel its gaze upon me. It was watching me, waiting for something. I didn't want to move any closer. But the melody pushed me forward. It tugged at me, drawing me in like a moth to a flame. The more I resisted, the more I could feel the music gnawing at my sanity. I took a step forward, then another. Each movement was like fighting against an invisible current, but I couldn't stop. The figure grew nearer, and with each step, the music grew louder until it was all I could hear. All I could feel. The moment I reached the figure, it reached out, its hands, or what I could only assume were its hands, grabbing at my arms. I gasped, feeling the coldness of its touch, like ice crawling under my skin. "What do you want from me?" I cried out again, but this time, the figure didn't respond with words. Instead, the melody surged, a deafening wave of sound crashing into me. I felt my knees buckle, but the figure held me up, its grasp tightening. And then I felt it, something inside me began to change. The world around me started to blur, and the melody, once something that had haunted me, began to shape itself. I could feel it writing my thoughts, my emotions, every decision I made. I wasn't just hearing the music anymore, I was becoming part of it. The figure leaned in, its cold breath on my face, and I knew, deep down, that I wasn't going to escape. Not this time. And then it whispered, "You've already been here before." The words hit me like a slap, but before I could react, everything went black. I awoke to silence. The first thing I noticed was the absence of the music. For a moment, I thought maybe it was all a nightmare, just a terrifying figment of my overworked mind. I tried to move, to sit up, but my body felt heavy, unresponsive, like I was wading through deep water. When I finally managed to stand, I realized I wasn't in the alley anymore. I wasn't even outside. I was in a room dimly lit, with cracked walls that seemed to stretch into an endless void. The air smelled stale, thick with the dust of forgotten places. I turned in circles, trying to orient myself, but the room had no discernible corners, no doors, no windows. It was just an empty space, seemingly endless. The only sound was the faint echo of my own breath, and it reminded me of the way the melody had once reverberated in my head, leaving me breathless and aching. And then, I heard it again. At first, it was a whisper, distant and fading, as if the melody had been waiting for me to notice. Slowly, it grew clearer until it filled the room. The same haunting tune I had heard every night, only now it was more urgent, more insistent. The music reverberated in my chest, vibrating against my ribs like it was trying to claw its way into my soul. I pressed my hands to my ears, hoping to block it out, but it didn't help. It was inside me now, impossibly close. The music pulsed with a rhythm that felt like a heartbeat, and every time the notes shifted, I felt a jolt run through my body, like a spark igniting under my skin. "Stop," I whispered, trembling. "Please, stop." But the melody only responded with a sharp, dissonant chord, as if mocking my pleas. I forced myself to move, my legs stiff and unsteady. I wasn't sure where I was going, only that I needed to get away from the music. But no matter which direction I walked, the sound followed me, circling around me like a predator waiting to strike. As I walked, I noticed something strange. The walls, once cracked and worn, were beginning to change. The cracks stretched out like veins, branching out in every direction, pulsing in time with the music. The walls were alive in the way the melody had been, the way I had felt when it gripped me, when it forced me to move. And then the figure appeared again. It was just like before, no clear features, just a silhouette of darkness against the shifting walls. It stood at the edge of the room, watching me with an intensity that made my skin crawl. I froze. My heart began to race, thumping loudly in my ears. The melody was louder now, a chaotic blend of high-pitched shrieks and deep, guttural growls, and the figure, the thing, seemed to be the source of it. Its presence was suffocating, pressing in on me from all sides. "You can't escape," the figure finally said, its voice low and unnerving. "The melody will always follow." I tried to speak, to protest, but my throat felt tight, choked with the weight of the sound. My legs trembled beneath me, and I fell to the ground, unable to stand any longer. The figure stepped forward, its movements slow, deliberate. The walls seemed to bend around it as if yielding to its presence, and I realized, with a sinking feeling, that the room itself was part of the trap. "Why?" I gasped, my voice cracking. "Why are you doing this?" The figure tilted its head, as if considering my question. It didn't answer right away. Instead, it moved closer until it was standing directly above me. I could feel the air around it shift, a cold breeze that carried a faint, metallic scent. "You have already heard it," it said. "You are already part of the melody." I didn't understand. Part of the melody? What did that even mean? I wasn't a musician. I wasn't some instrument that could be played. But in that moment, I realized that the figure was right. I was the melody. The music, the pain, the terror, it was inside me now. It was in every breath, every heartbeat. It had woven itself into my very being. "No," I whispered, shaking my head. "No, I won't." But the music was already pulling me in, lifting me off the ground. My body moved against my will, my limbs jerking as though the melody was controlling them. I couldn't fight it anymore. The sound, once distant and faint, now consumed me entirely. The figure stepped back, its form dissolving into the music until it was one with the sound itself. And then I knew I would never escape. This was my fate now. The melody would follow me wherever I went. It would haunt me, consume me, until there was nothing left. I wanted to scream, to run, but there was nowhere to go. The music had taken everything. And I was the music. The walls continued to pulse with the rhythm of the melody, undulating in time with the music as if they, too, were part of the symphony. I was trapped in a waking nightmare, my body moving to an invisible tune, helpless, caught in a dance that I couldn't escape. Every step, every motion felt like it was being dictated by the melody, and I was nothing more than a marionette. The figure, the thing, was gone, but its presence lingered in the air, heavy and suffocating. It had left behind a silence, a void, a feeling of inevitability that gnawed at the edges of my mind. There was no more music, but I could still feel it. It was in the way my heart beat, in the way my thoughts hummed and buzzed, as if the sound had somehow become part of me. I stumbled through the endless space, my feet dragging across the floor. I didn't know where I was going. I couldn't even tell if I was moving forward or backward. It didn't matter. The room, the walls, the very air around me had no end. They stretched on forever, an eternal loop, just like the melody. And then, from the corner of the room, I heard something. A soft, almost imperceptible whisper, faint at first, but growing louder with each passing second. I turned, my body moving on its own accord. The music had returned. But this time, it was different. It wasn't the haunting, dissonant tune I had grown to fear. It was soft, almost comforting, like a lullaby, a melody of peace. It wrapped around me, pulling me in, soothing my frayed nerves, coaxing me to surrender to it. I should have been afraid. I should have run. But I couldn't. The music had taken hold of me, and the more I listened, the less I wanted to resist. The walls, once oppressive and jagged, began to soften. The cracks faded, replaced by gentle curves, warm colors filling the space. The room no longer felt cold and isolating, it felt inviting. Safe. But I knew better. I knew this was just another trick. And then, I saw it, at the far end of the room, standing in the dim light, was a figure. It wasn't the same one as before, but its presence was just as overwhelming. This new figure was cloaked in shadow, its face obscured, but there was something familiar about it, something human. It raised a hand, its fingers stretching toward me, beckoning me forward. The music swelled, and I felt my feet moving toward it, as though the melody itself had taken control. I wanted to fight it. I tried to scream, to break free of its grip, but my voice was swallowed by the sound, lost in the growing crescendo. The figure spoke. "You've been waiting for this," it said, its voice like velvet, smooth and alluring. "You've been waiting for the moment when you finally understand." I didn't want to understand. I didn't want to know why this was happening, why I couldn't escape. But there it was, the truth, creeping into my mind. "This is your fate," the figure continued. "The melody has always been a part of you. You've just been blind to it." It reached out again, its hand trembling with the same eerie, hypnotic rhythm as the music. I could feel the pull, a magnetic force drawing me closer, drawing me into the very heart of the sound. I took a step forward. I had no choice. And as I reached the figure, as I allowed myself to be enveloped by the melody, I heard the final note, the one I had been waiting for, the one that would end it all. A single, perfect sound that rang through the very core of my being. And then everything went silent. For the first time in what felt like an eternity, the music stopped. I stood alone in the void, the weight of the silence pressing down on me like a suffocating blanket. My heart, once racing with the pulse of the melody, now beat in perfect stillness. I couldn't move. I couldn't breathe. The air around me had become thick and heavy, as if I were drowning in it. And in that silence, in that empty space, I realized the truth. The melody had never been a separate thing. It had never been external. It had always been within me. The music was me. And as I stood there, trapped in that endless silence, I understood that there was no escape from it. No way to break free. The melody would always be with me. In the quiet. In the chaos. in the spaces between breaths. And so, I stood, waiting for the next note to begin. How would you feel if you could see your future before it happened? Not just a glimpse, but in vivid, undeniable detail. What if the images you saw were your fate, slowly being painted before your eyes, inch by inch, stroke by stroke? That's what happened to me. It all started when I wandered through the old market that morning. The scent of dust and decaying leather hung in the air as I strolled past stalls, each piled high with forgotten relics, old records, chipped porcelain, rusted tools, and, of course, art. I'd always been drawn to paintings. They had a way of transporting me, making me forget the mundane. So when my eyes landed on a particularly odd piece, I couldn't look away. It was an old landscape, the paint cracked and peeling in places, the colors faded as though time had swallowed its vibrancy. A stormy sky hovered over a desolate village, and in the distance, a figure stood near a winding road. There was something about the figure that caught my attention. The stance was stiff, the posture unnatural, almost like it didn't belong in the scene. The vendor, an old man with hollow eyes, noticed me eyeing it. He stepped closer, his voice low and raspy. "That's a special one, you know. A unique painting. It changes." "Changes?" I asked, intrigued. "Yes," he said, his lips curling into a knowing smile. "It shows you things. Your future, perhaps. If you stare long enough." I didn't know why, but I was drawn to the idea. I didn't have a great future ahead of me anyway. My life was monotonous, routine, nothing special. So I handed over the small sum of money, took the painting, and left. At first, nothing happened. The painting hung in my living room, its stormy sky and distant figures simply staring back at me. For days, I barely noticed it. It was just another piece of art in a room full of things I didn't pay much attention to. But then, on the fourth day, something shifted. I was sitting at my desk, the dull hum of my old computer filling the room. When I glanced at the painting, I felt a chill crawl up my spine. The figure in the painting had moved. Not in the way a painting of a woman might move in a ghost story, but subtly, its head had turned ever so slightly, as if it had noticed me watching. My heartbeat quickened. I stood up, walked over to the painting, and inspected it. Nothing had changed in the landscape itself. There was still the storm in the distance, the village lost to time. But the figure, it wasn't just standing there anymore. It had moved closer to the road. My pulse quickened. I'd been so sure it hadn't been like that before. That night, I couldn't sleep. I kept glancing at the painting, half expecting to see something more. But as the hours passed, the painting remained still, silent. I thought maybe it had been my imagination, a trick of the light. The next day, though, I found something else. The figure in the painting was still there, but now there was a new detail, a shadow in the foreground, partially obscured by the storm clouds. It looked like a man, but his features were hidden by the angle of the shadow. I stared at it for a long time, trying to make sense of what it could mean. The vendor's words echoed in my mind. "It shows you things. Your future, perhaps." Was this my future? Was I meant to follow the figure on the road? What was it trying to tell me? As the days passed, the changes kept coming. The figure kept advancing down the road, closer to the village. The storm in the background grew darker, more ominous. The shadow was no longer just a shape in the clouds. It became clearer, more defined. The air around the figure seemed to shimmer, like something unseen was watching me. I began to wonder if I was just imagining things, if I was just seeing patterns where none existed. But the painting didn't stop changing. It kept revealing new details, things I hadn't noticed before. And that's when I realized that the painting wasn't just showing me a story. It was showing me my story. The road, the figure, the storm, these weren't just symbols. They were my future. A future I couldn't escape. One morning, I woke up to a sight that made my stomach twist in horror. The figure had reached the village. But it wasn't just standing there anymore. It was kneeling, its hands pressed to the ground, its body bent in a way that seemed unnatural. And in the background, in the village, there was another shadow, darker and much larger. I had no idea what it meant, but I knew it was coming. Whatever the painting was warning me about, it was getting closer. And it was going to be worse than I could ever imagine. I spent that entire night awake, staring at the painting. The figure in the village, kneeling on the road, seemed almost to be waiting for something. And the shadow behind it, much larger, more menacing, was the true source of my dread. Its form was vague, but there was no mistaking the sense of impending doom that it conveyed. The storm, now a violent whirlpool in the sky, crackled with a strange energy, as if even the air itself was charged with something dark and malevolent. As the night dragged on, I could feel the presence of the painting as though it had become a living entity. My mind raced, trying to make sense of the images. Was this some kind of twisted warning? A foretelling of something yet to come? I decided to visit the market again, hoping that maybe, just maybe, the vendor would have an explanation. When I arrived, I immediately spotted the old man sitting at the same worn-out stall with his cluttered collection of relics and antiques. He looked up as I approached, a knowing glint in his eyes. "You've seen it, haven't you?" he asked, his voice low and gravelly. I nodded, unsure of what I was asking. "What is this? Why is it showing me my future?" The old man didn't answer immediately. He only looked at me with an intensity that made my skin crawl. Finally, he spoke again. "The painting, it doesn't just show the future. It shapes it. It alters the path you walk. The more you look at it, the closer it brings you to the fate it's portraying. You can't escape it." I recoiled, a shiver running down my spine. "Are you saying I'm going to die? That's what's going to happen?" He shrugged, his wrinkled face impassive. "I can't say for certain. But that shadow, it's death. A force. And if it's coming for you, the painting will make sure you see it. It will make sure you're ready." I didn't know what to make of his words, but the weight of them sank into me, like stones in my stomach. The idea that the painting was guiding me toward an inevitable death was too much to bear. But the more I looked at it, the more I realized I couldn't look away. There was something magnetic about it, something that pulled me in, like I was trapped in its spell. The next day, I tried to ignore the painting. I covered it with a blanket and pushed it to the far corner of the room, hoping that out of sight would mean out of mind. But it was as if the painting knew, as if it could sense my reluctance. That evening, when I uncovered it, the painting had changed again. The figure on the road was now standing, facing directly toward the village, its posture more rigid. The storm was closer, its winds howling as the clouds churned like a living thing. The shadow had grown, now stretching across the entire canvas, as if it was reaching toward the figure. And then I saw it, the figure had eyes. I blinked and stepped back, my heart racing. It was impossible, those eyes weren't there before. I had studied the painting countless times, and I knew for certain the figure had never been given such detail. But there they were, staring at me from the canvas, dark and hollow, as if the painting itself had awakened. That night, sleep was out of the question. I could hear the wind howling outside, its mournful wail echoing through the cracks in the walls. The storm was closing in, and in the back of my mind, the image of the figure's eyes haunted me. The next morning, I went to work, but my thoughts never strayed far from the painting. I couldn't shake the feeling that it was following me, that it was lurking in the corners of my life, just waiting for the moment to reveal its final stroke. I tried to keep busy, to focus on the mundane, but my mind kept returning to the scene on the canvas. When I came home that evening, I knew something was wrong. The painting, still on the wall, seemed to shimmer in the low light of the room. The figure, no longer just a shadow, was moving. Slowly, almost imperceptibly, it took a step forward on the road. I rushed toward it, unable to help myself, drawn by some force I didn't understand. The figure's eyes followed me as I approached. But now, the eyes were not just watching, they were waiting. They were expecting me to come closer. I stood there, rooted to the spot, my breath shallow. The room felt colder, the air heavier, as if the storm had entered the space with me. The shadow had moved, too. It was closer now, its outline darker, clearer. It no longer looked like a vague shape, it had become a towering figure, its form unmistakably human, but somehow wrong. There was an aura of death that clung to it like a shroud. I stepped back, heart racing, but as I did, I heard a sound, a low, mournful whisper that seemed to come from the painting itself. "You can't escape it." The voice was a hollow echo, like the sound of the wind whistling through the trees, but it sent a chill straight to my core. I stumbled backward, my legs trembling. The painting was alive, and it was showing me a path I couldn't avoid. I turned and ran from the room, but the voice, the whisper, followed me. It was as if the painting had opened a door to something dark, something terrifying, and now it was closing in on me. Every step I took, every breath I drew, was one closer to the inevitable. And I couldn't shake the feeling that the figure in the painting was watching, waiting for me to walk that road it had shown me. I spent the next few days in a haze. The painting was all I could think about, even when I wasn't looking at it. It was as though my mind was consumed by it, like a slow-moving infection that spread through every waking thought. I couldn't sleep, I couldn't focus, and I couldn't shake the sensation that I was being followed by something far more dangerous than just a simple painting. I returned to the old man at the market, desperate for answers. As soon as I walked up to his stall, he looked at me with that same knowing expression. It was as if he had been expecting me. "You've seen it, haven't you?" he asked again, his voice almost amused. I nodded slowly. I don't know what to do. The painting, it's changing. It's showing me things. My future. The old man's eyes darkened, and he leaned forward slightly. "You can't escape it. The painting is more than just art, it's a reflection of your path. What you see is the future, yes, but it's also the future you're drawing for yourself. Each day you look at it, you're reinforcing that path. You can't stop what's already been set in motion." I felt a cold rush of fear settle over me. I couldn't breathe. But what if I stopped looking at it? What if I just get rid of it? The old man shook his head. "It doesn't work like that. You can't destroy what's already been set into motion. The painting doesn't rely on you looking at it. It's already tied to your fate. It will show you, and no matter what you do, it will find a way to lead you to the end." I could feel the weight of his words pressing down on me. What was I supposed to do? If there was no escape, then why was I even trying? Is there anything I can do? I whispered, almost pleading. The old man's gaze softened, but it was no comfort. All you can do is wait. The painting will show you when the time comes. And you'll know when the moment is right. You'll know. But be warned, the closer you get to the end, the harder it will be to turn away. I left the market with a heavy heart, feeling the weight of my own helplessness bearing down on me. The old man had said there was nothing I could do, and yet I couldn't stop myself from wanting to fight it. I didn't want to die. I didn't want to face whatever that shadow in the painting represented. I couldn't stop thinking about the painting, but I didn't dare go near it. It called to me, though, in ways I couldn't explain. It was as if the very idea of turning away from it made it more powerful, more insistent. That night, I gave in. I covered my eyes, not wanting to see, but my hands moved on their own. I pulled the blanket off the painting and stared into it once more. The figure in the painting was now closer to the village. I could see it clearer than before. It was wearing dark, ragged clothes, and there was something so unnatural about its posture, as if it wasn't meant to stand that way. It was bent and twisted, as though it had been pulled from the ground itself, from some deep, dark place. The storm raged in the sky above it, but it was different now. The winds were no longer just a background feature, they were alive. They swirled with malevolent force, tugging at the figure, urging it forward, toward the inevitable moment. And then there it was, the shadow. It was no longer just a vague shape. It was unmistakably there, stretching out from behind the figure, reaching toward the village. Its edges blurred, darkening the space around it. I could feel the coldness of its presence, like a suffocating cloud, blocking out the light. I reached forward, my breath shallow, as the shadow began to expand. And then, just as I thought the figure would move again, the ground beneath it seemed to crack, and the shadow grew still. It was almost as if the painting had frozen in time, as if it was waiting for me to make the next move. That's why I saw it. The final image. In the farthest corner of the painting, I could just make out the form of a figure, dark, indistinct, but unmistakably a silhouette of someone who was standing alone in the middle of the road. It was me. I staggered back, my body going cold. My heart pounded in my chest. The painting had shown me everything, but not the way I expected. It wasn't just a glimpse of my future. It was my end. The shadow that had been growing in the painting was my own death, stretching closer with every breath I took. For the first time since buying the painting, I realized the full scope of what it had done. It wasn't showing me what would happen, it was showing me how it would happen. Each new change, each new detail, was a step closer to the inevitable. I closed my eyes, trying to block it out. But the image of my own death was burned into my mind. The figure in the painting, me, was waiting for the moment when the storm would finally consume everything, including my life. It was then that I understood the true nature of the painting. It wasn't just a reflection of the future. It was a promise. A promise that no matter what I did, the path it had drawn for me would be the one I had to follow. And death, it seemed, was an inevitable part of that path. The days following the revelation felt like I was living in someone else's body. I moved through my life mechanically, my every action dictated by the vision I had seen in the painting. Each time I looked at it, I saw more details that were unmistakably tied to my future. And each time I saw the shadow growing closer, I felt the weight of my own mortality pressing down on me. I couldn't escape it. I tried to avoid the painting, to keep my mind off it, but it was impossible. The more I ignored it, the more intrusive it became, invading my thoughts, my dreams, and even my waking moments. I would hear the rustling of wind in my ears, feel the chill of the shadow creeping closer. It was as though I was trapped in a loop, unable to escape the inevitable end. I returned to the old man at the market, desperate for answers. His stall was empty when I arrived, and for a moment I wondered if I had imagined everything. But then I saw him, standing in the shadows of the alley, watching me with that same unreadable expression. "You're back," he said softly, his voice carrying an odd sense of knowing. "You've seen it, haven't you?" I nodded, unable to speak. I didn't want to admit it, but the fear in my chest was unbearable. The painting was no longer just a curiosity. It was a force, a malevolent force that I couldn't escape. "You know what's coming," the old man continued. "You can feel it, can't you? The moment is getting closer. The end, it's near." I swallowed hard, my throat dry. Is there no way to stop it? Is there no way to change it? The old man sighed, his gaze never leaving mine. "You're asking the wrong question. The real question is not whether you can stop it, but whether you can accept it. The painting has already shown you your fate. The only thing left is for you to walk the path it has drawn for you. There is no changing it." I wanted to scream, to argue, but the words caught in my throat. The hopelessness of it all settled over me like a suffocating fog. There was no escape. There was only waiting for the moment when the painting's prediction would come true. "Can you help me?" I asked, my voice barely a whisper. "Please. I can't stand it anymore." The old man's face softened, but it was a sad softness, like someone who had lived through the same torment. "I can't help you, but I can warn you. The painting is not just a reflection of what's to come, it's a warning. It shows you your fate, yes, but it also shows you the choices that lead to it. You might not be able to change the end, but you can change how you get there." His words left me feeling more confused than ever. How could I change something I had no control over? How could I change a fate that had already been written? "I don't understand," I said, shaking my head. "What do you mean? How do I change it?" The old man took a step back, as though he had already said more than he intended. "You'll know when the time comes. You'll know what to do. Just remember this, the painting shows you the future, but it's not set in stone. The choices you make, even now, matter." With that, he turned and disappeared into the alley, leaving me standing there, alone with my thoughts. I returned to my apartment that evening, my mind spinning. The painting was still on the wall, its dark figure staring back at me. But now, it felt different. There was a new sense of urgency, a new presence in the room. The figure in the painting was no longer just an ominous shadow, it was a presence, something that was waiting, watching, and drawing closer with every passing moment. I stared at it for hours, lost in the details, trying to find some clue, some way to change the inevitable. But there was nothing. The shadow had already crept over the landscape, and I could see my own figure standing in the middle of the road, waiting for the storm to swallow me whole. The wind howled outside, and I couldn't tell if it was part of the storm in the painting or if it was real. The sound of it seemed to echo in my mind, louder and louder, until it drowned out all other thoughts. My heart raced, and I felt the walls closing in on me. I turned away from the painting, my breath shallow, my hands trembling. The old man had said the choices mattered, but what choices could I make now? The painting had already shown me the end. It had shown me the storm. It had shown me my death. And yet, there was still time. The storm wasn't here yet. The figure in the painting had not yet moved. Maybe I could do something. Maybe I could stop the path I was on. But what? I didn't have the answers. I didn't know how to change anything. But as I stared at the painting once more, I realized that the real danger wasn't the shadow. It wasn't the storm. It was the waiting for something I had no control over. I had to make a choice. And I would make it soon. But as the painting stared back at me, I felt the chilling sensation that the final stroke was already being drawn. The days blurred together. I couldn't tell if I was losing my mind or if the world around me was slowly slipping into madness. The painting had taken on a new life, almost as if it were alive, watching me, following me. Every morning, I found myself drawn to it, unable to resist the pull. Every night, I lay awake, listening to the wind, hearing the eerie hum of the painting's warning reverberating through my thoughts. I kept hearing the old man's voice in my mind, his words echoing, "The choices you make matter." But the more I thought about it, the more hopeless it seemed. Could I truly change my fate? Could I escape the storm that loomed just beyond the horizon, a storm that was getting closer with every breath I took? The final scene was set. I could see it now in its entirety, the storm clouds rolling in, the gusts of wind, the figure standing in the road. And I knew that the figure in the painting was me. I had tried everything, avoiding the painting, leaving the apartment, even trying to destroy the damn thing, but it always came back, no matter how far I went. It was as though the painting was tied to me, feeding off my fear, growing stronger the more I resisted. It was pointless to run anymore. The storm was coming. But what if the painting didn't just predict the future? What if it was more than just a passive reflection of what was to come? What if it was actively shaping my destiny? Was there a way to stop it, to change it from within? I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being manipulated, that the old man had known this all along. He had warned me, but I hadn't understood. He had given me the key, but I hadn't known how to use it. The painting, it wasn't just showing me the future. It was creating it. I stood before the painting now, trembling with the weight of my realization. The figure was moving in the painting. Slowly, imperceptibly, it shifted. The shadow had extended, the storm clouds inched closer. The figure raised its hand, and I could almost feel its fingers curling toward me, as if beckoning me to join it, to step into the final moment. I could hear the wind outside now, stronger, more insistent. It howled through the cracks in the window, rattling the glass, and I knew that the storm was near. The storm I had seen in the painting, the one that would claim me. But then something shifted in my chest. A spark of clarity. A whisper of defiance. Could I face this head on, or would I let the painting take me? I reached out, my fingers brushing the surface of the canvas. The moment I touched it, I felt a surge of energy, a sharp jolt that ran up my arm, as though the painting had come alive. The figure in the painting jerked, as though startled by my touch, and then, almost imperceptibly, its movement stopped. The shadow halted in its tracks. I pulled my hand away quickly, heart racing, and took a step back. The room seemed to shift, the air thick with tension. The painting was no longer just a reflection of what was to come, it was a battleground, and I was standing at the center of it. I didn't know how, but I knew that this was my chance. My chance to fight back, to break free. Without thinking, I grabbed the painting from the wall. It felt impossibly heavy, its presence anchoring me to the spot. I tried to shake it off, but it wouldn't budge. The more I struggled, the more the wind howled, louder and louder, until it felt as if the storm had entered the room itself. The painting began to tremble in my hands, as though it were alive, as though it were resisting me. Then I heard it. A voice, soft at first, barely a whisper. But as I focused, it grew louder. "It's too late." The voice was familiar, a haunting echo of the words the old man had said, but it wasn't just a voice. It was the voice of the painting. It was the storm, the shadow, everything that had been feeding off my fear and my hesitation. It was the culmination of all that I had avoided, all that I had tried to ignore. "You can't escape. You've already chosen." The voice was a part of me now, seeping into my thoughts, my soul. And in that moment, I realized something else. I hadn't just been trying to avoid the storm, I had been running from myself. The painting wasn't my enemy. It wasn't the storm. It wasn't the shadow. It was me. The choices I had made, the way I had allowed fear to control me, this was what had brought me here. I had already sealed my fate the moment I let myself believe that the painting was something outside of me, something I couldn't control. But now I understood. I dropped the painting to the floor, my legs giving out beneath me. I was no longer fighting it. I had stopped fighting the inevitable. The storm was here, and I couldn't escape it, but I could face it. I could face what was coming. I could stand tall, even if the figure in the painting, myself, was waiting. I heard the final, deafening roar of wind as the shadow in the painting leaped toward me. And in that moment, I knew that the storm wasn't just outside, it was within me. The final stroke had been made. And now, I was free. The painting lay still on the floor, silent, its secrets finally revealed. But as I stood there, breathing deeply, I knew that I was no longer the person who had stumbled into that market. I wasn't the same man who had been afraid of what was to come. I had become something else. And I was ready. It's hard to say what happened next. It's as if time itself had suspended its march, the seconds stretching into infinity, holding me in that moment of realization. The storm raged on outside, its fury palpable, yet somehow distant, as if I had crossed some invisible threshold between worlds. I wasn't sure whether I had truly escaped it or if the storm had simply ceased to matter. The fear that had once gripped me began to dissolve, like mist in the morning sun. The painting remained on the floor, its colors still vibrant, its form now static. The figure in the storm, the one that had haunted me with every waking moment, no longer moved. Its hand, once outstretched toward me, now hung limp at its side. It wasn't the same figure anymore. It felt broken. I stared at it, but it no longer felt like a threat. It felt like a part of me, an old version of me, frozen in time. A shadow of who I had been before I came to understand the truth. I walked away from it slowly, not needing to look back. The storm had passed. The wind had died. The silence that followed was profound, a deep stillness that filled the room like the calm after a disaster. There were no more whispers in my ear, no more dark figures moving on the edges of my vision. But even in this calm, I could feel a change. It wasn't just the room that had shifted, it was me. I had faced something far more terrifying than the storm or the figure in the painting. I had confronted my own fear. I had come to terms with the inescapable nature of fate, of life, of death. The painting, now still, had shown me that there was no running from what was coming. It had been both a warning and a gift, reminding me that life isn't a straight path, and no matter how much we try to control it, we are all subject to the same forces, the forces of time, choice, and consequence. In the end, I didn't feel victorious. I didn't feel free either. What I felt was an overwhelming sense of release. The weight of the unknown had been lifted. I understood now. The future was not something to fear or fight, but something to accept. The painting remained on the floor, silent and still. But I knew, in some strange way, it was no longer necessary. It had served its purpose. It had shown me the path. And now, I could walk it, step by step, unafraid. I never looked at the painting again. It remained in that quiet corner of the room, abandoned and forgotten, as I moved on, finding peace in the present moment, no longer chained to the predictions of an uncertain future. The storm had passed. And so had I. Hope your dreams are filled with fear. Good night.